better when we all do better. You can't get better than that. Yeah, we all do better when we all do better. You can't get better than that. I said we all do better when we all do better. You can't get better than that. Yeah, we all do better when we all do better. You can't get better than that. We all do better when we all do better. We can't get better than that. Say we all do better when we all do better. We can't get better than that. Come on. I said we all do better when we all do better. We can't get better than that. We all do better when we all do better. We can't get better than that. We all do better when we all do better. We can't get better than that. Come on, y'all.
And that ain't no crime. And that ain't no crime. ain't no crime.
On.
What's happening, people? Another Friday night of madness here with Gangstagrass, keeping it live and hanging out on Zoom with you, funky people. Tell us what's up in the chat. Where are you watching from? What would you like us to talk about? Any questions that you have about life, the universe, and everything?
My question is, why do we suddenly have two pharaohs? That's what I want to know. There we go. Okay, that only slightly
Do we need to have the talk
changed
about the
everything.
birds and the bees?
Pharaohs do multiply.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Had a couple of conversations about that recently. Like, why haven't I multiplied yet?
Yeah. We got Nolly in the Twitch and Rusty and Jan, all these cool people joining us. So cool. Nolly can't stay long. So, well, let's give some positive energy out to folks to make sure that they're going to be doing all right.
Yeah, how's everybody doing? Is everybody doing okay? I hope.
Yes, we do have David Dylan Thomas popping in with us in probably 10 minutes. Hey, Argenowith. Yeah, we see you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm.
Yep. So we have author, an academic, and generally awesome person, David Dylan Thomas, dropping in with us later, pretty soon, as I say, probably about 10 to 15 minutes. And we will be talking very extensively about cognitive bias and how to break down the system of cognitive biases and how to design systems and organizations and plans in a way that fights against and mitigates those cognitive biases that are part of human something. Maybe it's human nature. I don't know. We can ask him about that. So that is coming, and that should be, I feel like a lot of what David Dylan Thomas says about things is really positive and uplifting. So I hope if Noli is able to keep hanging out, that will help shift some energy over there. That's what we're always trying to do.
We got more cool friends joining in. Melanie and Suze are here. What's up?
Hey, Melanie and Suze.
What's up, Melanie?
We got Brett over in the YouTube. Hey, Brett.
Yeah.
And everybody, you know, like if you're excited, if you're half as excited for this guest as we are, you know, feel free to put together some questions. You can drop them now in advance and we'll get to them. Or you can, if you just think of them in the middle of the stream, you know, just shout them out. But then type them and submit them as a comment because we can't hear you wherever you are. But yeah, any kind of questions. I'm looking forward to asking, is cognitive bias bad? Is it bad?
I think it's I can't make the phrase without thinking, is that bad?
Is that bad? I was thinking more Mr. Mackey. I was just thinking, is cognitive bias bad? Yeah. Okay.
And we actually have a couple more awesome guests lined up in the next few weeks that I'm also very excited to have on the stream. So pretty soon we're going to have Paul Porter as a special guest on the live stream a week from now, and that's going to be awesome. And a few weeks from now, we will have Reese Palmer on to talk with us about all the awesome stuff that she's been doing.
Like with country music?
Yeah,
with music and
with her awesome album.
Mm-hmm.
Some very dope songs, powerful stuff.
Yep. Really cool podcast that she's been doing called Color Me Country, where she's been exploring a lot of really interesting angles on the country music industry and race and the people that are making music a little bit outside the industry that need a little bit more attention. So it's right up our alley, and it's going to be a really cool conversation.
Yep.
Yeah, she's been chatting up with a bunch of our buddies.
Mm-hmm.
Just because, to say again, like, when people see what we do and they go, oh, bluegrass and hip-hop, okay, so, like, white music and black music, you put it together, the short answer is, yeah. And then the long answer is,
no.
These musics,
Not exactly.
Yeah, you got to take a look at your assumptions and your preconceptions as to, like, like, whose music is this, like, just sort of deconstructing all that stuff. So we really enjoy getting into that with people who find that sort of thing interesting.
Yeah, because the long answer of it just sparks off of the fact that all of that comes from the people who all came here around the same time. So it's not either. So,
I actually, speaking of origins of music, I attended this talk this past week about Arnold Schultz and him, being a big influence on bluegrass. And I didn't really fully understand how much of an influence he was on Western swing as well.
Cool.
He influenced, I think he got around, maybe not Chet Akins, but someone, maybe a precursor to Chet Akins. I'm trying to remember who he got into, or who he influenced on the West.
Are you chilling with Bob Wells or Spade Cooley and stuff?
Yeah.
Pharaoh introduced me to Bob Wills.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Thank you for tuning in, folks. It is 9:15, and it is now time for us to give our call sign, which is just our best, everybody's best Bob Wills impression on 3. And 1, 2, 3. My Bob Wills impression quickly turns into Mr. Hanky. So he's so excited, like he's so into it, and he's just calling out, like, Pharaoh's taking a fiddle solo, and just right in the middle of the solo, he just yells, "Fiddle!"
Oh yeah! Shout out to Michelle out there. I see you out there.
Yeah.
Thanks for the suggestions on the equip. Just some of it out these past week.
Yo, real quick, Dolio, you got a real fly shirt on this evening. Like, let me get that.
This thing, I don't remember where I got this.
It looks like something from my closet. I want that.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's probably Old Navy or something.
Back in the day.
Old Navy, is that fly?
Nah, I think it's Express.
And Michelle's in the Twitch too. What's up, Michelle?
Yeah.
We got to actually run into Michelle not too long ago.
Live and in person. It was so different.
Yeah. Gangstagrass went and got shot.
Yep.
We
got shots and then we got
really
shot.
Cool.
We got
That was really cool. That was a cool photo shoot. Like, as far as Gangstagrass as the professional band, we got it done. We got the sunlight in, and we all look beautiful. So, for us,
can we talk about the auto mod? You guys on YouTube and Facebook, you're really missing out if you're not getting the primo experience over in Twitch. We have it all. We have all the bells and whistles. We've got auto-moderated comments. So if you say a word and we don't like it, boom, we just can't see it at all. Any kind of word. The word could be bog. The word could be what's another one? I've seen
in this case it was bog.
I've seen some real amazing choices of, like, that's not okay. No, that one doesn't get through. Nothing gets through.
You know what's crazy is for some, it seems like it wasn't moderating last time because we saw a bunch of stuff.
Yeah. Oh man, that was amazing. A mile of glass.
Okay.
Mile
We had
of
quite a
glass.
compliment. And
Yo, that was a super duper compliment.
yeah.
Oh, what?
Yeah, what was that compliment?
We can't repeat that here.
Yeah.
You have to have watched the stream.
Yes.
You can go back and watch it if you want to. I think it's there.
Oh, this was the
This was
this was
during
the one. Right. I was just
Yeah.
thinking like
Oh, yeah.
I haven't missed a stream in a while, but yeah, okay.
It was pretty.
Yeah, it was
it was
quite
pretty
good.
great. It was pretty great. Brought great delight to our faces. So if you go back and you watch the last week's team stream, which was just Wrench and Dolio and me as the last people waiting to get our COVID test before heading home. You if you watch it on YouTube, or I guess it's archived on Facebook too, you will just see the looks on our faces. If you go back and watch it on Twitch with the comments, you will see why we have that look on our face.
Yeah, buddy.
Now I gotta know. Hey, you know what? I'll be right back. I'm just gonna go watch this.
it's
Indeed.
pretty good.
Take me like an hour or two.
It's pretty good. I was so dazed. It's funny, like now I'm back in my house and we're all in our safe little boxes and everything's fine.
The little boxes on the hillside.
But it was,
The boxes made a turkey.
is this a song you all know? What song is
And
this?
they all look just the
I
same.
mean, I know it from the show Weeds.
Yeah, from Weeds.
Yeah.
You should know it because you binge watched it with me.
What?
It was great. It was great
Was I
because
asleep at
it's
the time?
is it I forget, was it actually a Pete Seeger song or was it a Malvina Reynolds song? Because the main theme song is the version performed by Malvina Reynolds, but then for one of the season finales, it might have been season 2, they had the Pete Seeger version. It was just
It's
It's
Pete Seeger. It's Pete Seeger's song.
They kept changing it up.
yeah.
But I still want to know what Tiki Tack is.
It's the stucco probably, or like
Oh,
No,
Okay.
Ticky Tacky is just, the crap they use to make some of these modern buildings.
spackle. Spackle and drywall.
it's just too.
Yeah.
No, okay, what's everybody's views on Spackle? Because I feel like this is one of those things that is a divisive issue. I personally am fairly strongly anti-Spackle.
And what's everybody's views on Smackle?
I think that's something that only Pimp Urkel does.
Urkel.
Smackle?
You don't have my money.
Oh no! Oh no! Oh no! This is right up there with like Kenan Thompson as Pimp Snuffleupagus in the like gritty adaptation of Sesame Street that they did when David Harbour was on SNL.
Oh yeah. Yo,
Oh
but
my god, gritty
Yeah.
Ulupagus. I love
we
it already.
all saying this like Steve Urkel, like the guy, like Jaleel White isn't like 7 feet tall.
Wait,
Oh yeah, he's tall.
He is
He's
a
real tall.
gigantic man.
no.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
I missed like an hour of packing before we left because Family Matters came on, and I was just like, "Well, I'm sitting here and watching this now." It was great. I didn't know Family Matters came on at 4:00 in the morning.
Forgetting that that's actually the name of the show because in the black community we never said Family Matters was
Urkel.
coming.
Yeah.
Urkel's about to come on.
What about the rest of the family?
For the longest time, I didn't understand what people kept saying, like, come on, Family Matters. I was like, I don't know that show. What are you talking about?
See, this is exactly what happened to me. We were talking about the band Blur, right? And everybody's
Right, and
just
I was like,
oh,
song
yeah,
two,
song
song two is the
Love Song
greatest.
2. And I was just like, what an ambiguous thing. Is this like track 6? Is this like 17 seconds of silence? Or is this like some sort of out there experimental noise track? And I was like, all right, fine, let's listen to this
Right.
song 2.
And
And
it's
it
the
comes
song.
on, it's like
It's the
"Woohoo!"
song.
And I was like, oh, the song called Woohoo.
The song.
That's the song we're talking about. Woohoo by Blur. And I look at it and it's just like song 2. And it was at that moment I knew
Bernie.
that someone had gone in and erased part of my brain and changed it for a part of the brain that remembers an alternate reality, because it's not what that song is called. It's Berenstain Bears.
Oh, yeah, we may have discovered a new Mandela effect situation.
At perfect timing as we're talking about what I think I believe to be true.
Nice segue.
Welcome,
Hello, everybody.
David,
Hello.
Dylan, Thomas. Hey.
What's happening?
Pleased to meet you all.
Yeah, pleased to meet you, man.
Howdy.
Welcome to the Gangstagrass live stream.
My pleasure.
So I was fortunate enough to get to meet Dave here virtually at South by Southwest. I'm comforted to see you were in the same location as you were at that time. And, you know, it was one of those sort of unusual things that Gangstagrass does, where, you know, there were a bunch of sessions where you could, you know, meet and get like mentorship and advice and thoughts from all this amazing array of people. And I was curious what a researcher in cognitive bias and an expert in design specifically around taking into account cognitive bias might say about the sorts of issues that a band like Gangstagrass runs into around things like, you know, what people think that they like, and you know, what the bandwagon is doing at the moment and where people are in relation to that. And I just thought that would be a really interesting conversation. It was such an interesting conversation that we now are very happy to have David Dylan Thomas with us to talk about this. We've gotten a lot of excitement from the folks out on the Facebook land and in Twitch land about this. So thank you so much, David Dylan Thomas, for joining us. How?
Pleasure. And it's funny, like my fan base, if I can call that a thing, there's some crossover, because I had a whole bunch of people when I was posting about this being like, oh my God, Gangstagrass. And like Emily Tershoff, I hope you were able to join. She says hi. I think her power went out, so I hope you're out there.
Hi, Emily.
It'll be
Hello.
archived, Emily. It'll be archived.
Yeah, this COVID's knocking out people's power all the time. It's crazy.
Happened to us just a few days ago. We were in the hot tub when we lost power.
Good 5G though. We got really good 5G, so the reception is stellar now.
That's right. So one of the things that I'd like, place where I would like to start is you have said that cognitive bias is a set of shortcuts. And I was wondering if you could explain cognitive bias to us and explain that a little bit.
Sure. So cognitive bias is really just a bunch of shortcuts your mind is taking just to get through the day. Like you have to make something like 1 trillion decisions every day. Even right now, I'm making decisions about where to look, how fast to talk, what to do with my hands, right? And if I thought really carefully about every single one of those decisions, I'd never get anything done. So it's actually a good thing that we spend a lot of our lives on autopilot, but sometimes the autopilot gets it wrong, and we call those errors like cognitive biases. It's funny when I think about it in terms of music, like I've played music and I've like played guitar, and when you're playing guitar, you're not thinking about playing guitar. If you did, you would suck at it. You have to get to a point where you're not thinking about it anymore. And so that's kind of like what cognitive bias is like. It's stuff you're doing without even thinking about it.
Wow. That's great. That's super.
You said you call it cognitive bias only when it goes wrong? Or
Yeah, so like the technical term is a heuristic, like when you're just something your head does to like just make a quick decision. But if the heuristic gets it wrong, like so a good example is illusion of control. Like if I'm playing a game where I have to roll a die and I need a high number, I tend to roll it really hard. If I need a low number, I tend to roll it gently. And we know it makes no difference how hard you roll the die, but in situations where we have no control,
No. A soft roll will get a lower number. That's
it's proof. That's just science.
This is so wonderful.
It's an asymptote where if you just drop the die straight down, you get a natural 20. It's fact.
That's true.
I just finished binge watching Harmon Quest, so this is excellent. By the way, we need to do a group D&D thing.
But it's basically bias. So is bias used similar to the definition that you use in the physical world, where bias is the irregularities or the variance?
So how do you mean like in the physical world?
So like if you have like
in an engineering sense.
So something is not totally round or spherical. There's a bunch of like sort of a texture to it that gives it that variance, the irregularities.
So almost like a lack of balance?
Something that deviates from the uniformity of the shape.
There's probably a similarity. I don't actually know what the etymology of bias is, but there probably is a common root, because it is this idea that like you're going off the rails there. Like this shortcut has taken you to a place you didn't want to get to.
Interesting. So speaking of a place maybe you didn't want to get to, how did you get to this place of studying cognitive bias and getting so deep into it?
Hey, come on.
So I started out, it's funny, like I have like musical roots, I have filmmaking roots, like I'm a storyteller by heart. And that got me into like technology. My way into technology years ago was in online education, writing seminars and stuff like that. And so I got into like what eventually became called content strategy. And then while I was learning about that, I had met my wife, who was a neuropsychologist. And I learned a lot about the brain from her. My mom was a psychology major at UCLA, so I learned a lot about the brain from her. And it was really when I saw this talk by Irrespondet called Gender Equality by Design, which is this brilliant talk that kind of made the link between like hiring biases and pattern recognition. So if in my brain, when I think web developer, I think skinny white dude, even if I'm not explicitly misogynist or anything, if I see a name at the top of a resume that doesn't fit that pattern for what I've seen in my life as this is a web developer, I might start to give that resume the side eye. And so when I learned that something that terrible could come back to something as simple as pattern recognition, I just went full out and I like literally studied one bias a day for like a year. And I became the guy who wouldn't shut up about cognitive bias. And my friends were eventually like, Dave, please just get a podcast. And so I got a podcast, did like 100 episodes of that. And then that started to tie into my day job, which was content strategy and UX. And that's where it got into Design for Cognitive Bias, which is the book and the talks that I give now.
That's wonderful. I'm so delighted it led you in that direction. And I really would love to dig deeper into this resume thing, especially because we have a programmer with us here, Dolio the Sleuth, and and a big part of what he does is teaching and making sure that graduates from shout out to Zip Code Wilmington, that their graduates are getting great jobs and doing amazing things, and and if there are these barriers from people's cognitive biases potentially in their way, can you talk about some of the ways to get around that, to mitigate that, to eliminate that? I know there was something in Philadelphia that you might be able to talk about regarding that. Love to hear about all of that, and Dolio, of course, jump in with any further questions you have on that.
I'll have something to add to that once you're done too.
Sure. Please do. So one of what I would call like a short-term like solution or approach is to think about things like anonymized resumes, right? So there's literally an experiment where you have two identical resumes, and the only difference is the name at the top of the resume. And if it's a male name, it tends to keep going through the process, and if it's a female name, it tends to stay in the pile. And the idea is, well, why do you even need to see the resume in the name in the first place? Like, what about seeing the name is actually helping you decide who to hire, right? You want to know about the qualifications. You want to know about the experience. Whatever you're reading into the name in terms of gender or race is kind of just noise. It's not actually helping you make the decision. And if you've got these biased patterns in your brain, it's actually going to make it harder to make a fair decision. So let's just eliminate that. And City of Philadelphia, where I'm in media, just outside of Philly. City of Philadelphia did a round of anonymized hiring for a web developer. And it was funny, they realized that to anonymize the resume, the best way to do it was to physically print it out, get a marker, and redact it like a CIA document. And then they might find a resume they liked. And they would go to this website called GitHub, which is where you can kind of find a web developer's like portfolio. But the problem is, as soon as they got there, right, what would happen? You'd see all the personal information of the web developer. So they actually wrote a code that would anonymize that as the page loaded. They took that code and they put it back on GitHub, and it's actually there now if you ever want to try doing some anonymized hiring yourself. But that at least it feels like a short-term approach. We can talk about the long-term, but short-term, that's a good way to say, okay, look, I know you've got these biases. Let me just take that name away because I know it's going to bias you.
I wonder if you've been involved with this conversation about the sort of AI biases that are coming along with facial recognition software. And, I'd like to talk about a solution for that, but at the same time, I don't like facial recognition technology being a pervasive thing. So how are you sabotaging that? Is what I'm trying to say.
So let me tell you about this. So this is years ago. There was a group. I'm blanking on their name now, but they were doing. I think the phrase was like neurological Afrofuturism. It was awesome. It was this exhibit actually at South by Southwest, and one of the things they had, and this is a real thing. It was a scarf, right? Like a hijab-like scarf, right? And the pattern on it could fool facial detection. Because if you looked very closely, that pattern was made up of tiny little faces. And like, I think 90% of the facial recognition software out there, when it would look at it, would just freak out because there was just too many faces. So it was actually the stealth way to sabotage, like, as you say, sabotage that technology. So there are ways to do it. I'm getting that
scarf right now.
Right? Like yeah.
Right.
Let me get
face
that.
mask with faces on it. Yes.
I'm getting that pattern tattooed on my face.
Exactly. Right. But I have to imagine like everyone wearing masks now is also kind of screwing with it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like that. What was I going to say about that? But that during the 2020, during summer of 2020, and every company in the world was like, "Oh, we believe Black Lives Matter now." Like there were a handful of companies that actually did something that made it seem like they really meant it. And I will say this: IBM shut down their facial recognition division. Like they're like, we're not going to pursue this anymore because we see where this is going. So they felt like you did. They're like, we don't want to touch that, right?
That's no. I wish other companies would get hip to that. Like, let's not make that future. We've all seen Black Mirror. Let's chill.
Yeah, exactly.
Black Mirror, and then also like the Social Dilemma, which I was going to ask you if you've seen that, just with your background in UX and everything. I feel like you would have been on the Social Dilemma. I don't know if you ever worked with social media specifically, but the general point that they make about algorithms, I think, is really interesting, and it basically comes back to, this false hope that people have that, like, okay, well, understanding we have cognitive bias as people, but the computer is going to be fair, and missing the basic point that, like, we built the computer, and that algorithms are essentially going to take any kind of pre-existing biases that already exist and just amplify them further and further. And this can apply to social media, it can apply to advertising, it can apply to hiring, and it can apply to, so like with the applicant tracking software that people use to apply for jobs today, maybe your name doesn't throw a bias with a person, but just because there's a machine screening it doesn't necessarily make it any fairer. And then we even see this in, a lot of people find our music on YouTube or Spotify or something, and it's recommended through algorithms, which of course benefits us, but we're very aware that, like, it's built on this system that just, yikes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No, just to say, like, so let me tell you a story about AI. So Amazon creates this hiring bot, right? It's going to help them sift through resumes and make better hires. And the AI just keeps recommending dudes. It is super sexist. If it sees even the name of a woman's college on a resume, it downgrades the resume. So it's like aggressively sexist. And they're trying to figure out what's going on. And they said, okay, well, how do we train it? What data do we use? Well, we used the last 10 years of resumes to Amazon.
Oh.
Seems like a reasonable thing. Guess what most of those resumes had in common? Right? It's mostly guys. And so the AI takes a look at that and says, oh, gee, you sure must like dudes. And then just keeps recommending dudes. Like, AI is not this magical thing, right? It is a glorified prediction engine. Mm-hmm. And if you point it at a racist, sexist world, it will make racist, sexist predictions, right? And if the people programming it and tasking it with stuff are coming at it from this, angle of, well, I've never had a problem being discriminated against, right? It will never occur to them that they're baking that bias right into the AI itself.
Okay. Was it IBM they had a bot that it was like a Twitter bot that they had programmed, and it took maybe like less than 24 hours before it just started tweeting out anti-Semitic stuff?
Yep. I was talking to an AI expert about this, and they said, like, the one lesson, you never let an AI learn unsupervised. And that's what they did. They just showed it Twitter and, like, what do you think it's going to, have you seen Twitter? What do you think it's going to learn if you just point it at Twitter and let it do whatever it wants?
Like Lord of the Flies all over again.
Yeah, this is so juicy. I know we all want to delve into this. Really exciting. I want to make a note first, though. I think a lot of the people that are tuning in with us right now are on the level and are on the page with us, but there might be a few people that we're trying to help catch up. So just to give the 101 context for this that I'd like to sort of put around it is that we're exploring things here that help us understand in the instance of things like sexism or racism, that those aren't just about people intentionally being sexist or racist. So some people still have the impression that when we're talking, when you talk about racism, you're just talking about, those individuals that are like, I hate black people or I hate women, and that there's so much embedded in society that doesn't even require somebody to intentionally be reproducing it, that it comes out anyway. And so that's part of the context when we talk about things like racism and sexism, that these systems that make it so that somebody doesn't even have to, intentionally be trying to discriminate, that it happens anyway. And one example that this brought to mind was some people laugh at things that might seem trivial, like students protesting their school because the automatic hand soap dispensers don't recognize black hands as well as white hands, which seems like a trivial
That's why I have a problem.
Yeah, it seems like a trivial thing until you start thinking about the fact that that's the same process at work that you would have in optical heart monitors that might, be a life or death thing for people, or facial recognition things that might.
Or whether or not a car knows to stop if there's someone in front of them.
Exactly. Well, a lot of the things that we're talking about are about the sort of bad biases that are in the world and how we want to kind of make up for them. And I have read your book's title. Got
a lot further than most people.
I've read a few blurbs that made me feel like it was kind of implied that there's also an element to this that could be about utilizing biases for good, sort of like tapping into biases with design that actually pushes things in a good direction. I'd love to hear about that too.
Oh, and if I can piggyback on that too, I'm interested in places specifically also where you can use one cognitive bias to knock out another.
Mm-hmm. Ooh, can I triple piggyback on that?
Yeah.
So I read this. I read this paper a while ago called "Care, Control, and Conviviality in the Politics of Technology," and I just wonder: is there a way through what you're saying to get around this cognitive bias to that care and conviviality instead of that control that we're being led to?
That's a really great approach, and I only want to add, just because Wrench was mentioning the
this is piggy pile.
just because he was mentioning the difference between sort of conscious and intentional discrimination or exercising bias versus the unconscious bias. I want to also just mention, since we're talking about these things, that is all separate, or it's different from, but intersects with what we talk about when we're talking about systemic structures, like systemic racism is a different thing, but is also another thing that you may not be conscious of. So there's at least those multiple things going on, which can all kind of play in if somebody says, for instance, oh, I'm not racist. There are a lot of things going on. There might be, your own personal bias, unconscious bias, and also systems going on. So just figured out.
Yeah. All right, let me say knock all of that out with like two stories. One.
Get this pile.
What you were saying about like the systems, right? So I said that the anonymized resume is short term, right? Why only short term? Because even if I come up with the perfect anonymized resume system, the pool of people applying for that web developer job are still mostly white male. Why? Because the hurdles they had to get through to get into that hiring pool are different than the hurdles that women have to get through, that black people have to get through, right? If I want to fix those hurdles for black people, I pretty much have to go back to 3rd or 4th grade. For women, I have to go back to about 8th grade because that's where they're starting to drop out of STEM. So there are big systemic things I have to fix if I want to have a fair hiring pool. That's going to take a while. In the meantime, I don't want you to see the name, right? Story number 2 that I think hits a few of these different points. So Trisha Prabhu, 14-year-old, who gets into the Google Science Fair with a platform called Rethink. It's a social media like plugin that she creates specifically to fight cyberbullying and teen suicide. All it is you're about to post something hateful to Twitter and you hit send, and then this thing pops up and says, Rethink has detected that this might be hurtful. Are you sure you want to send it? That's it. That's the whole idea. Over 90% of the folks in her original test group, and these were adolescents, right? Not the most impulse control savvy folks in the world, right? Over 90% stopped and didn't hit send. So to the whole point of, can you use bias to fight bias? Can you use design to curb bias to do some of these for good? That design choice is slowing down something called the framing effect. Rather than just rushing into a decision, it creates some friction and lets you stop and think about what you do first, right? It takes advantage of this other part of your brain that says, oh, wait, let me think about this first, versus the bias part of your brain that's like, let's go ahead, right? And in terms of like what we were saying before about implicit bias versus explicit bias, 90% of the people out there, right? If we're kind of extrapolating a little, 90% of the people out there aren't evil. They're thoughtless. It doesn't occur to them there's a human being on the other side of what they're doing. As soon as you remind them there's a human being, they back off. Now, 10% of the people saw that warning and said, yeah, I want to send something hurtful, right? So there is explicit racism. There is there is violence. We know that. We know that all too well. But it's about maybe 10%. Let's keep our fingers crossed. It's about 10% of the actual human population, right? 90% are just trying to get through the day. And they're just responding to the systems that already exist. They're not thinking about them. They're just living, right? But so that to me, like, I don't know, touches on all the things you're talking about, because they all do work together.
You won the piggy pile.
Yeah.
I was like stacking up. I'm like, wait, but then there's wait. Okay, let's see what he did.
You got it. You really got it. You hit all those points. I'm so impressed right now.
You're talking about the whole thing about, I guess, the next step after the anonymization of the resumes. Because part of that is what I do is the training of people to get them into development and into these positions. But we specifically target people who are outside of the realm. So we're retraining people, adults who have already, been out there in whatever field they were doing, from, anywhere from, bagging groceries to working on cars or cutting hair, and sending them into development positions at Fortune 500 companies. So, catching them at an earlier age will prevent the need to retrain later. But from what I've found is that people having that outside experience actually gives you a more diverse set of developers, because when you deal with people who've always been on the track of development, you always get the same solutions. So especially most products now are being interacted with people of all walks of life when it comes to the apps that you're using. So, and you can usually look at a product and tell it was made by engineers for engineers.
Yeah, you can.
You know what I mean? So I'm a big fan of having people go and do something else before they start getting into it.
Absolutely. And like, what I keep recommending, in order to curb bias, because the fact of the matter is you're never going to get rid of it. Like I said, you need it to live. You're not going to get through the day if you have to think about every single decision. It's to bring in people who have different biases, right? Not zero bias, different bias, right? So that person bagging groceries has a completely different lived experience than the guy who was born to be an engineer, right? And got every break and is now an engineer. And that perspective, right? There's a thing called red team, blue team, where you have a blue team who does like the original design, maybe does some research and maybe gets as far as like a prototype of whatever it is. But before they go any further, a red team comes in for one day and their job is to go to war with the blue team. And they're to find all those little hidden missing potential causes of harm, right? Or the more elegant solutions that the blue team missed because they had confirmation bias and they loved their first idea and they were just sticking with it. And that red team is always better if it's made up of people who aren't like the blue team, right? That's where I want that person who's bagging groceries to come in and say, yeah, that's great, but did you consider this, right? Yes.
I feel like that's how we work as a band when we make songs.
Yeah.
And meals.
And meals, yeah.
Yeah.
How do you mean and meals? How does that work?
We had a great meal when we were in quarantine together. Dolio.
So many great meals.
We just collabed on it. There was one night where Dolio was making tortillas. What were those tortillas called specifically? Were they just tortillas?
Well, there was also
we made
the
tortillas
parathas.
and parathas, but the parathas
Yeah,
were not
parathas.
handmade. The tortillas were handmade.
Yeah. The fried fish and Dan was
we
on.
making fish tacos, yeah.
Yeah, fish tacos.
Yeah.
I was doing fish in the air fryer, and we were doing tortillas with corn flour.
I was making the sauteed kale. I think I put something else in there. Oh, and I made the asparagus too. And it all came together like.
I don't think that it was greater than the sum of its parts. I would
Pretty
say.
good.
Yeah.
Sorry, what were we talking about just now?
What?
Actually, like music and food, though, are like perfect examples of where it is so much better if you get different voices than if it's just the same thing, right?
Right.
That and breeding.
You could spoil families, see how they go.
Yeah, because like a dog breeding that has been selecting for one set of traits.
Right. You'll end up with a dog who has a brain too big for his tiny head.
Yeah, the dog.
I thought that was the best dog.
Yeah,
They
I have all
reward
kinds
that dog.
all kinds. Yeah, the dog gets rewarded for living up to these set of traits, and then further bred to be cute or whatever.
Right.
Meanwhile, it has heart problems and bad hips and
Hip
whatever.
dysplasia, yeah.
And that actually, in general, any breed of dogs or any dog that's coming from a more mixed heritage is going to be a healthier dog. And that's kind of, I think that's kind of true of animals across the board.
And the interesting thing about that too is that it sounds on one level like it's making the point that any intentionality is flawed. Like you shouldn't try to breed dogs intentionally. But on another level, you could say, well, it's okay to breed dogs intentionally, but maybe you should be breeding them taking into account, like, are they healthy? And not, maybe the problem is, you have an incomplete data set and your intentions are sort of limited and focused at the expense of maybe something that you should have been thinking about. So maybe the problem is just sort of limited, sort of comes down to a garbage in, garbage out.
I think think of it as a parable about the fact that anybody's
Thanks, KDJ.
idea about genetic purity and like racial purity is total BS, even just from a health standpoint.
I think that when you're making something, right, and you've got a plan, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, and you're not thinking about who is that going to impact, and of all the people it's going to impact, who has the least power in that group. If you're not consulting them, then yeah, you're gonna. I don't care how much intentionality or lack of intentionality you have. Like you're gonna give somebody a really bad day. So if you're gonna say, hey, I'm gonna breed these dogs to have this whatever trait, it's like, did you ask the dogs? Like Dalmatians. I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but Dalmatians, right? Why do you see them in? Why are they the favorite dog of firefighters?
Because it looks so good with the red fire. Oh, really? Is that why?
Oh, I didn't know that.
I might be, but they can't hear. That's part of their pure breeding. One of the side effects is they're just terrible hearing, which means that when the big loud sirens go off, they don't care. They've had hearing bred out of them. But no one asked them, like when they started breeding Dalmatians, hey, do you like being able to hear?
It's like you think a few decades of, crossbreeding dogs is going to, be better than the millions of years of evolution that it took to get them to what they were before.
And even the crossbreeding, it takes a while. I rescued a Saluki who was mixed with most likely golden retriever, but Salukis were bred for thousands of years to be sight hounds, and as a result, many of them have early onset degenerative blindness, as my dog did. So, you're breeding sometimes you're breeding for a characteristic, but it ends up, because you're breeding for it, you end up getting those recessive genes in there pretty strong and doesn't go the way you're intending. That's a really interesting application of cognitive bias.
I want to see if we can get into breeding, like when it comes to plants, because I was watching something earlier about this farmer. He took a really natural method to finding the best seeds to breed, or which which trees were going to give the best seeds. And he'd basically just watch them grow and watch which trees were getting the diseases, which I think it was he was growing chestnut trees, which trees were getting this particular mold, which ones were growing really healthy. And he wasn't assuming anything of it. And in that unassumption, I think there's this like quality of superposition in there, that you're getting all of these possibilities because you're not putting a bias in immediately. And I wonder what that looks like for cognitive bias. If we're decreasing our cognitive bias, how does it look to you in increasing our possibilities?
Funny because you mentioned, just from you mentioning chestnuts, it reminded me that is the reason we don't have American chestnuts anymore. Is because of the breeding and the selection by growers and all of that stuff. When a blight hit, it wiped out all the chestnuts in North America pretty much.
Right. The same thing that could easily happen to bananas or terrifyingly rubber.
It's
That
happening
happens
to
to rubber,
bananas.
we're in so much trouble.
Yeah, it's happening to bananas now, actually. But we'll talk about that later.
Okay.
On a different show. That's a different show.
Well, no, okay, so it's Arbor Day. Happy Arbor Day.
Hey.
I was reading this article about how trees, like if you have a forest and you look at how the trees talk to each other, and they do, like underneath the ground, like they've got these like different kinds of symbiotic relationships with different, flora and fauna that are in mushrooms and whatnot. But like they're able to do things like say, hey, I'm sick. There's this thing attacking me. Every tree like me up-regulate this particular defense you have, right? And if they pattern like how these trees, it looks like a neural net. It looks like a brain, like one big brain. It is fascinating. And the thing you're saying, like about sort of like selective breeding actually leading to extinction, it reminds me of something called zero risk bias. And zero risk bias, and I am super guilty of this, but zero risk bias is basically that bias where if I say, hey, we're going to do an experiment and there is a 5% chance that you're going to get a mild electric shock. But if you pay me $10, I can reduce that to 1%. If you pay me $100, I'll reduce it to 0.1%. People will rather pay the $100 just to go from 1% to 0.1% because they want as little risk as possible of anything bad ever happening. And when people were originally like freaking out about carcinogens in food, the first laws about that basically said, okay, you can have 0 carcinogens in any food. And what ended up happening was the food companies started producing to get around that, because to get to 0 chance, you have to like mess with what you're making. And they basically took food that had like from like 0.1% chance of carcinogen, reduced it to 0, but then had like 1% of heart disease and increased it to 12, right? Oh. And it's because we love certainty. Like we love not having to think about things. And it drives us to do some really stupid shit. And the problem with trying to get to certainty by just focusing on one trait in a tree or one threat in a food is that it ignores the fact that things are systems, that everything is connected. And so if you mess with this one trait in the plant, it's not going to stay with that one trait. All these other things are going to be connected. And if you don't have an inkling of how that's all connected, you're going to mess something up.
And if anybody has not read the short story, Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Birthmark, I don't know why it occurs to me often. Like I think of this often, and it really comes back to sort of the fun. It's an early Gothic. It's an early example of Gothic horror, sort of. And basically, it's a scientist trying to modify, things to remove imperfections. And turns out you can, but at a cost. Basically exactly that.
And that brings us back to the bias, because it is bias that makes something be considered an imperfection rather than just a variance, which is also, ironically, bias.
That's a good point. And Pharaoh was mentioning before, sort of thinking of it in terms of maybe try to just adjust your outlook and adjust, like look at your need for control. Like why are you trying to do that at all? This is something that's come up with my therapist, has talked a lot about this fundamental idea of accepting contradiction. Like in life, let's say two things are true and they're in conflict with each other, and you have a choice. You know, you can sort of say, well, I'm just going to believe this one thing and I'm going to reject the other thing, or believe the other thing. But what you really are going to need to do a lot of the time is just accept that, like, maybe two things are true and they don't really seem to make sense, but you have to accept that because it's life.
Yeah, and plus one to normalizing therapy. I am also in therapy. I've learned so much, and I'm so much less.
I just started
my own suffering than I used to. So plus one to normalizing that. But yeah, and I think that looking at the need for control, there is so much there. Like so many biases. Like I said, comes back to like, why do you want certainty? Because you want to feel like nothing bad's ever going to happen to you. Like that's just a natural instinct, right? That's something that's kept us alive as a species, right? Is just optimizing for survival. And I think someone once said, we're trying to run compassion software on survival hardware, right? Like that's the tension.
So right. That's so right.
The social dilemma,
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure, just because they talked a lot about the hardware on there. They talk a lot about just like we've been bred, we've been evolved for millions of years to avoid danger, to avoid risk. So all that stuff, you can take advantage of it if you want, but or you can do good with it. But it's very pre-existing. It's very ancient.
Well, if you remove any possibility of anything quote unquote bad happening, even the assessment of something being bad a lot of times is a bias in itself. Is more just a different thing. You end up, I guess, inhibiting the growth a lot of times, especially when, and you can see that with plants. You know, if you remove wind from plants, you get weak stems.
Yes.
Some of my favorite lines from a movie ever is from Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. China Fat says, "No growth without resistance."
Ooh.
Right.
Ain't it the truth?
Great.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great movie.
And I mean, Dolia, you're talking about when, you know, imagining like a culture, a society where you try to remove everything bad. I mean, that's at least the last, like, every decade of the last century had some version of that, and then like for hundreds of years in Western civilization, at least, like there's been, I think, a really strong theme of that, a really strong theme of, you know, let's try to control. We're something. We're afraid of something.
I mean, yeah, you see it happening when things like, for instance, when we went from being a foraging and hunter-gatherers to cultivating crops and herding animals, then you start seeing things like heart disease, diabetes, because what happens is that you no longer are burning the calories that you would have to burn in order to go out and kill this beast, to go out and find as many berries as you need to get the nutrients you need. But you also now have things like leisure, art, music. So you're saying
those first hunter-gatherers did not have Peloton?
They were the Peloton.
It was like a Flintstone version.
Peloton, it looked more like a mammoth. or it was a saber-toothed beast that you had to run from.
Let's just bring back
workout
from predators.
Like,
that's a new exercise regimen. I'll just get a lion, put it in the street, step in front of it, and start running, man.
I've seen that movie, man. I've seen it.
There's a bias
because I feel like that's an interesting tension, right? To sort of say like, okay, we've got these big brains now. And even things like inventing fire meant we could make them bigger, right? Because now the energy we were expending, like processing that food, literally cooking it, did some of that processing before we put it in our bodies, right? And that
chemistry of it frees up the nutrients.
Right, it freed up, like it made us like get these bigger brains. Like, I mean, we could adapt stuff. And yet, to your point, like you then start to have that tension between like, okay, well, we don't have to run from tigers anymore, but our brains still think so. And like what gives me hope, I guess, or like on the positive side of that whole idea of would we be better off in caves is I forget who it was. They asked someone like, what was the first sign of civilization? Like, I think they asked a bunch of people. Like this one person's response was, oh, we found this bone somewhere. And they could tell it had mended. And they
Right.
realized that meant that someone broke their leg and someone else helped them
Right.
and made sure it mended. Because that otherwise it would have just it would not have mended that way
I
unless
was
someone.
just talking about this the other day. It's generally attributed to Margaret Mead. There's no hard proof of that, but it is the kind of thing that Margaret Mead would say, and that it was asked by a student of hers in anthropology what she considered the first sign of civilization to be. Most people guessing, tools and knives and weapons or whatever, and she said no, it was a bone that had healed because other people had been able to take care of it, and the person survived it.
Yeah, and that's a moment of a human helping another human.
Right. Instead of that moment in 2001: A Space Odyssey where the one monkey is just like, I can use this bone to smash my buddy's head in. Oh, we get rocket ships.
Yeah, they didn't show the second scene where he actually bandaged his buddy up. But then the third scene, he does hit him again.
So sorry.
That's
A bias that I really want to ask David about is the preference for simple explanations rather than complexity, which I have an understanding that sort of is something that has been studied a little bit.
Yeah, I mean it keeps coming back to, like I said, that desire, that drive for certainty, right? And so this leads me to my least favorite, most hated bias in the world, which is system justification theory. It's basically this notion that the world is correct, or just world hypothesis. The world is correct, the world is fine, the world is good. If anything bad happens to anybody, they probably deserved it because the world overall is just, right? And what leads that to certainty, right, is it is way easier to live in a world where everything is balanced, right, where everything resets to zero at the top of the hour. It's fine, right? It is a much more cognitive effort to live in a world that is unjust, where you can't predict what's going to happen based on if you're good or bad, or if you follow the rules or don't. That is a much harder world to live in. And some people have no choice. Surprisingly, a lot of people who are oppressed choose it anyway. They were talking to people who were poor but voted for tax breaks for the rich. And the theory was, they must be doing it because they think they'll be rich someday. But when they actually asked them, they had no illusions that they were going to spend their whole lives poor. They just believed that rich people deserve good things. They believed in hierarchy. And that's a much easier world to live in than a world where you every day wake up realizing that you've been cheated, right? So that desire to get away from it. Now, the weird thing about all that is we do actually enjoy novelty. We do actually enjoy uncertainty, but in very narrow contexts. So I'm a big movie buff, action movie fan. And I love watching a genre film and something that I didn't expect happens. I enjoy that so much more than if it's like, okay, same old horse premise, boom, boom, boom. That's fine. But like, oh, wow, that surprised me. I didn't see that coming. I'm much more interested now, right? Designers hate being given a bunch of instructions and saying, okay, make this. Musicians, you don't want to walk on stage and be like, okay, we already know what you're going to play. Just play this. And you know how to play this, right? You can read music. Just play this. It's like, no, I want to find something new. I want to create something, right? That's uncertainty. That's almost ultimate uncertainty, right? When you're writing a new song, when you're creating something, there's no more uncertainty, but it's exciting, it's invigorating. And so in some contexts, we love uncertainty. So we have the capacity to embrace uncertainty, but 90% of our lives, we just run to the corner, right? Just keep me safe.
I want to throw a little note in there. KDJ took, I believe it was Danjo's reading list suggestion of The Birthmark by Hawthorne. And on this illusion of control and certainty kind of thing, my favorite book of all time is Alan Watts' The Wisdom of Insecurity, which goes into, it sort of makes the kind of intellectual argument in a way that at least for me, stuck about how if the world actually were certain in all these ways that it is uncertain, or if the omniverse were certain in all these ways that it is uncertain, if people were predictable in all these ways that they are not predictable, that actually we wouldn't like that at all. we wouldn't actually enjoy living in a world where we knew everything that was going to happen. Yeah,
What is
which
that
is
called again?
important. It is The Wisdom of Insecurity by Alan Watts. And I know
Yeah.
Wrench and I have listened to a lot of Alan Watts, so it's always nice to listen to his voice, but it's a great read. It's a small book, but it is dense. So KDJ, there's another one for your reading list.
Which is probably what is such huge incidents of like drug abuse, depression, suicide amongst people that we would consider elites, because they have they have this tremendous degree of certainty within their lives, which is, I will never want for anything. But that seems to remove from them meaning.
Yeah, I think Jim Carrey too had mentioned, and this really stuck with me. He said something like, "There's nothing as scary as reaching sort of the point where you always thought like, this is it, this is going to be the success, like whether it's, you know, getting in this big movie or whatever it is, reaching that and realizing like, oh, I still feel like I feel, I still like that wasn't it. Oh my God." Oh no.
Yeah,
Right. Well,
Trent Reznor talks about that too, playing his first stadium gig, thinking, "Oh, this is gonna be it. I played a stadium, everything is," and then he gets off stage and he's like, "Shit."
Oh.
Right, people,
I
know the
people's
feeling.
brains tend to go back to their set point. We see the same thing with lottery winners. Plenty of research on that. That, you know, there might be a temporary effect, but people's brains go back to their set point, and you can affect the set point. That's a whole other stream as well about the neuroscience of that. But yeah, that's a very real phenomenon.
Yeah, it's called hedonic adaptation, and they did this thing where it's like they had a bunch of people who won the lottery and a bunch of people who became, I think, paraplegics. And beforehand, they had this like, what's your 1 to 5? What's your general level of happiness? And so, basically, I think it lasted about 3 months before the lottery winners went back to whatever their set line was, and the paraplegics went back to whatever the set line was. So it's like, if you're a sad bastard before you won the lottery, give it a few months, you'll go back to being a sad bastard. If you're like happy-go-lucky and you become a paraplegic, give it a few months, you'll go back to being happy-go-lucky.
Mm-hmm.
I really want to get to the other side of this conversation, and you know, right now we're at sort of advocating for like complexity, and you know, that's where we started with this. We started at this place of complexity, and it just reminded me a lot of. Have you guys heard of Drexia? The story of Drexia. It's this comic book about. The slaves that were tossed off during the Atlantic slave trade somehow developed into like an aquatic race and carried their culture, or carried the memories of their culture with them. But because those memories are so strong and so hard, that they choose one person in their civilization to carry those memories, and that person's sort of tortured by those memories, and everybody else has like vestiges of those memories, but they only come together every so often so that they all feel the memories and remember. But after coming from that, only one person keeps those memories for a while, and everybody else just lives with the vestiges. But that person's tortured, and the progression of it is this person decides like, no, you guys keep those memories. I can't be tortured by it anymore. I want to be away from it, and the civilization starts to, she goes away, she runs, and her civilization just starts to rage in the water and creates all these tempests around the world. So I'm getting, there's this Mingus quote. I'm trying to remember it perfectly, but making the complex simple is really genius. That's the second part of it. So there's an element of truncation that I think is important to understand within ourselves, and understanding our capacity to be, I guess, so complex. I'm sorry if the tendrils of this argument are sort of loosening at the end here, but do we need to be so complex all the time? You know, you talk about that 10% of people that still said the offensive thing in that study, and I think about the 10% of people in my life that might say something offensive, and I might laugh at it and like, well, somebody said it.
And I wanted to add to that too, that premise of having someone hold all the memories, that reminds me of a book I read when I was growing up called The Giver. And it's very similar idea in that you have one person who keeps the cultural history, and then he ends up, having to train his replacement, which is why he's called The Giver, because he's giving all of this to sort of the next kid. And it's a good book for young adults because it sort of, gets you started thinking about, like, if you didn't really have an understanding of the history of war, and then all of a sudden you do, like, you gotta process that. You gotta figure out a way to deal with that, and ultimately the kid is the one that turns away and decides, like, I can't be in this idealized society because sort of everything has gone wrong, ultimately because people aren't, like, this is the only person that thinks about any of these implications. But I mean, I don't know, it's interesting that, like, culturally, kind of like with cooking food and processing the nutrients, we also, as a society, and even before computers and the internet, we've had the ability to write things down and kind of put our thoughts, our more complex ideas, out of our heads. Like, we don't have to keep everything in our heads at the same time. I don't know if that's where you were going with it, Pharaoh, but it's an interesting thing that, like, we don't always have to be thinking about everything, because we can write it down and we can keep a record and we can sort of externalize.
I think that what we need to be careful of is offloading complexity without accountability. What I mean is, when you tell me those stories, what I keep thinking of is, America kind of made Black people their giver. Yeah. Right? Because they basically said, look, we did a lot of twisted shit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We don't like thinking about that. We like thinking about the American dream. And we like thinking that whatever crazy shit that went down, we were either justified or was a few bad eggs. So someone's going to have to live with that. Why don't we make it the people we did it to?
Right. And
So
occasionally
Native
go back to
Americans,
them
Black
and
people,
say, like, we say,
have to-
like, how, tell me again how that all went. Like, every
have to tell you
few
this.
months, or every
Exactly,
February.
right?
Every February, we're like, what was that thing? What was that story about the guy? Anyway, it was a great story. Okay, I'll talk to you about
But
this.
don't tell us too much about it.
You sign up.
Because we don't really want to get into it.
Right. And like every generation of, well, let's be honest, young white folks suddenly realizes, wait, we did what? And different generations have slightly different reactions to that. This one is having, I think, a very healthy reaction to it. But it's like, and oh God.
But at the
Whereas
same time,
we haven't really forgotten. We are not all shocked, right?
right, because they're usually like, oh my God, guess what I just found out? And I was like, oh yeah.
Yeah.
About
I was having an experience. I think earlier you're talking about when I just found out about Sarah Rector, and the story of this young Black girl in the early 1900s that became fabulously rich in Oklahoma, and the state legislature declared her white. And my mind was blown by this, and I brought it to the band. I was like, "Oh my God, this is crazy!" And Dolio was like, "Oh yeah, I remember that. I learned about that when I was a kid."
Yeah, it's like when people were like, when the Watchmen came out, and it's like a good, I guess, 40% of America all of a sudden found out about Tulsa, Oklahoma. It was like, oh my God, you mean that really happened? I was like, yeah.
I did think we all knew about
I
it.
learned about that as a kid.
I'll be totally real about it. I didn't learn about Juneteenth until I saw that episode of Atlanta.
Well, the thing is, I'm from the South originally, so like, I grew up in South where my parents were born in Jim Crow. The year I was born was when they started to integrate schools in my hometown. There were riots, people got murdered. My mother was in high school when that happened. They integrated the school that she ended up going to, which is why they had they still have segregated class reunions. We were having segregated dances and stuff until like 2000 and something. So when I moved up north and I tried to tell people what was going on down south, they did not believe me. They were like, nah, that's not happening for real. I was like, no, what are you talking about? they thought that stuff was like in the 60s or the 70s. I was like, no, it's happening right now. Like they had a Klan rally downtown in 1996.
This is why I don't know if you ever saw this SNL skit with Dave Chappelle and Chris Rock, but this is why there were like 2 black people in America who were shocked when Trump won.
Yeah.
Like I want to say that the number of black people who were shocked when Trump won versus the number of people who were shocked when Obama won. It's like, you know.
Yeah, I was shocked when he won, when Obama won. I was like,
yeah.
When he won Virginia, I was like, what?
I wasn't shocked because my grandmother in Culpeper, Virginia, told me she was voting for Obama, and I was just like, all right, now I know the outcome of the election.
I knocked on doors in Virginia for his campaign, and I had a lot of long conversations with people.
And after 8 years of Obama, I was like, okay, I see why.
We had that coming.
He was not going to change anything.
We walked right into that one.
We acted like it, though. We acted like it was going to change everything.
There was, years and years ago, it was 2013, 2014. It was early in the Obama presidency, and The Onion ran this perfect article about how the Republican Party is nominating a glowing white-hot ball of pure hatred to run against Obama. This was years ago.
Wow.
And then they did it. And
much later, they actually did it.
And part of that campaign worked because of the simple answers that it was providing to people who were frustrated. And so, something that's been on my mind lately, and I was ruminating about this on my live stream, is the need to embrace complexity more, because the simple answers often don't cut it, but they resonate more with people. People are attracted to simple answers that are simply not going to get you to the truths that we need to expose, because race is not simple and gender is not simple. And there's a lot of things that we need to delve into that we're just not going to have sound bites for, the way that people that want to keep things the same are going to have sound bites for, of like, oh, that's how it was, return to the greatness, whatever. And so the need to embrace complexity and to understand that there's complexity under almost everything, and to actually be excited by that instead of scared by it. And that is, anything can be delved into and bring you such an amazing new understanding. I was recently reading a book with one of my kids that was about trees, which I thought would be probably boring, right? Like how interesting are trees, right? And it got into how the trees use the fungal network to communicate with each other, and how even the definition of what a tree is actually hard to define, and all of these complications and how trees evolved and the reproduction systems that are really complicated. And my mind was totally blown, and it just reminded me of how much, to really start to really try to understand anything in life, you've got to get to the nuances and grapple with things that are hard, and like Dan was saying, that there'll be things that seem like contradictions. There'll be things that maybe don't line up exactly, that we don't have the answers to why they're both true, that you want to grapple with. And that's a good thing, but it's hard because as I understand it, people have a bias to tend to prefer the simple answers that are given to them.
And can I ask David something off of that? Because it's hard enough just to be thinking about it as yourself, like as one person, but then to try to have a conversation about any of these things. And like, I'm trying to figure it out and you're trying to figure it out at the same time. And we're actually trying to talk to each other in a way that, that works. I kind of want you to help us talk about not just politics, but I kind of, if you have any advice on how to have these conversations better. A great example comes to mind, certainly, is somehow gun control has become one of the worst conversations I've seen people just, endlessly over and over just fall back into, just like, total breakdown of communication, pretty much any time that comes up. And when I say it comes up, what I mean, of course, is anytime there's a mass shooting that happens every day. But that's just one example. I mean, talking about politics, like I I want to know, like, how do can we talk about 45 without mentioning his name? But like, because even in mentioning his name, wouldn't there be some bias that comes in and just says like, oh nope, shut it down, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to talk about this. So what do you have?
Yeah, so an important thing to understand is that political affiliations are like sports teams, right? They're not about ideologies, they're about identity. And if you attack someone's political hero, the part of their brain that lights up is the same part of the brain that lights up when they think about identity. You're not attacking Trump, you're attacking them. You're not attacking Biden, you're attacking them. And they literally are like, you might as well have just pulled a knife, right? That's my heart rate's gonna start increasing and I'm gonna get my knuckles off. You talk about like having conversations where you're trying to figure things out. That's the conversation to have, right? I do a whole talk about this, but I call it like the 3 rules of productive discourse.
Give us the talk.
Oh, it's called the content strategy of civil discourse, turning conflict into collaboration. But like the spoiler alert, the big flashy ending is just 3 rules of productive discourse, right? Like if you actually want to have a productive conversation, 1, agree that neither of us has the answer, right? If either of you actually think you have if we actually did have the answer, we wouldn't need to have the conversation. So check your ego, right? 2, right? If you say like, okay, neither of us has the answer, right? Then you're also admitting that we are both going to learn in this conversation. You're making a commitment that we are going to come out of the conversation smarter than we went in, not dumber. 2, neither of us will win. And this is the hardest thing for most folks because we're bred to believe that everything is a competition, especially in America. Everything has to have a winner and a loser. And again, if you're going into the conversation with that attitude, then you're not, even if you did win, it would only make one of you feel better until the problem rears its ugly head again because you were too busy winning to solve it, right? And if you want to have a fight, right? If that is literally what both of you want, great, go have a fight. Fights are fun. But if one of you is coming in wanting a fight and one of you is coming wanting to actually discuss something, okay, we've got a mismatch. Pick a different room because this isn't going to work. But if we both agree, we want to work on this together, great, then we're agreeing neither of us is going to win. Nobody gets a medal at the end of this. Fine. And then 3, we're here to create something new, right? And that assumes that we're going to bring out the best in each of us, right? And that there is a best in each of us to bring out. And that at the end of this, something will exist that didn't exist when we started. Because again, if the thing that worked already existed, we wouldn't need to have this conversation. But if you can agree to those 3 rules before you begin that conversation, it is much more likely to be a productive conversation. Again, unless, if you really want to have a fight, we already know how to do that.
That was the most Gangstagrass thing anybody said in a long time.
Yeah, exactly. And in addition to being able to watch that again by rewatching the stream, there is a like 5.5-minute video where David goes through all of goes through those 3 steps that you can find very easily on the interwebs. I have a question about step 2 on the understanding that this is not a win-lose situation. Is the idea of a zero-sum a zero-sum game or a zero-sum situation, is that itself a cognitive bias? This idea that if someone gains, then someone else must lose?
But it's bigger than a bias. It's a whole religion, binary thinking like that. And that like, that's my new hotness, is like trying to get around binary thinking. Sarah Walker-Betcher is amazing, and you should totally have her on here. She's been talking a lot about not just the destructiveness of gender inequality and all these other things, but how at their root is really the destructiveness of binary thinking. Because binary thinking will kill you, right? And we go back to embracing complexity, right? Like if you can get to a point where we talk about what are non-zero-sum games, right? Or cooperative games. Cooperative games is one of the most fascinating things I've been seeing. And it's literally a genre of games. So ironically, Pandemic is one of the most well-known cooperative games. It's a board game, and the whole idea is, hey, pandemic's wiping out the planet, and each person playing works together to try to stop the pandemic. And by the way, it's very hard to stop the pandemic. And there's a game that we play here. It is based on Sherlock Holmes, and like me, my wife, and my kid, pull it out and you get a case and you have this big map of London and you go around to different places and you try to solve the case. But you're not competing to solve the case. You're working together. And each of you are trying to put together the different clues that you're gathering. And it's a lot of fun. And nobody wins, over each other. I mean, you're basically playing against Holmes because he's always able to solve a lot faster than you, but it's this really enjoyable, right? That's the other thing. We think that, cooperating and sharing, that's boring. That's no fun, right? No, it's a lot of fun. And again, keeping hope that this generation, who's a little more into cooperative, non-zero sum gaming than like us older folks are like going to get that, whereas we're still figuring it out. But yeah, there is so much more potential, I think, in approaching things as a cooperative game as opposed to a competitive game. Like competitive games are great for movies and storytelling. They are shit for fixing the world.
Yeah. I've often heard of it. We've often heard of it described as like the difference between a scarcity mind state versus an abundance mind state. Whereas, like, if I have more freedom, does that take more freedom away from you? It's where they're, rather than looking at it as a bucket of freedom that everyone could share from, and the more freedom that each person has, the more free it makes you.
I'd like to vote for buckets of freedom.
Buckets of freedom.
Buckets of freedom be the unit.
I feel like I could probably hear you talk about the binary and how destructive that is for the rest of the night. But then we wouldn't have time.
Okay, let's do it.
If there's anything else you want to say on that before we move on from it, it just because and it maybe feeds into the next question that I had, which was going to be a combination of like, what is your favorite bias, and also like, what is a bias? Because a lot of this stuff we all here are fairly up. We're fairly well read. We have heard of some things. We know some stuff. And so some of these biases if you mention a thing like, I've heard of some of this stuff. I think some of us have heard of this stuff. So my question was going to be, what is a bias that is both, relatively not well known or understood, or even like people are, a lot of this stuff people actively deny and just don't want to acknowledge. But on the other hand, has huge implications, and you really wish people were thinking a lot more about, because like, I don't want to say everybody understands gender bias and race bias. I don't want to say that, but it at least is being talked about. Mm-hmm. Is there like a little thing? Maybe it's the binary. Maybe it's that. But what's sort of weird? Where do you want to go with this?
I don't know. When you talk about that, what I think of immediately. Well, first, one last thing about the binary. The other version, that like variation of that with the abundance versus scarcity, is also fixed mindset versus growth mindset, right? Fixed mindset, this is the way things are. I am this, right? Or I'm bad at this, and that's it. Like, it's fixed. Versus growth, which is more like, well, I'm not great at this right now, but I could be if I wanted to be, right? And like it embraces change, right? And like, this has real impacts, right? If I think about one of the big problems we see in diversity hiring is you bring in some people of color and they're gone 6 months later because you didn't make them feel welcome. And the reason you didn't make them feel welcome is because you wanted them to assimilate. You had a fixed mindset about your company. This is our company. This is our culture, the end. Versus a growth mindset about your company, which is to say, oh, you know what? We're just going to keep changing and evolving. If we're the same next year as we are this year, that's a failure. And if you're hiring people with that mindset of, I'm hiring you because I want you to make us different. I'm hiring you because you are not like us, right? That's a completely different mindset. And I guarantee you that person is much more likely to stick around because you actually value their difference. When people talk about diversity hiring, I keep saying, look, think of it like the Avengers, right? I'm not going to hire 5. If I already have Iron Man, I'm not going to hire 5 more Iron Man. I'm going to say,
5 Hulks, come on, 5 Hulks.
I need a Hulk. Now I need a Black Panther. Now I need a Scarlet Witch. Like, I need all this. Like, I'm going to keep. And if you look at the actual history of the comics, they keep. Like, everybody's been the Avengers by now, right? Like, I think I've been in the Avengers at this point, right? But they keep mixing it up because that keeps them fresh. It keeps them powerful, right? That's how I think people should think about like fixed versus growth mindset. To go back to like that, what's that secret bias? I mean, the overarching one I keep coming back to is framing effect. So framing effect is basically like, if you go to a store and you see a sign that says beef 95% lean, and next to it is a sign that says beef 5% fat. Like, which one do you think people are going to line up for? It's the same thing, but I framed one of them to seem more appealing. Or if I say, okay, these condoms are 99% effective, but these condoms over here have a 1% failure rate. Again, it's the exact same thing, but one of them seems like I should really be getting that one and not the other one, right?
But can we talk about that? Does anybody want to buy condoms that put that up front? Like, I mean, just saying, like, if I saw that, I'm like, I'm sorry, but no.
You're just not trusting their choices of marketing in general there. Thinking that maybe there's some knock-on effects as far as the choices they're making.
It's the exact same
thing.
Fact, but I framed it slightly differently, right? To make it seem more appealing. Now that's, okay for like beef, but what if I say, hey, should we go to war in April or should we go to war in May?
We're definitely going to war. It's just a question of when.
Right? I managed to gloss over that, right?
Eliminate the question of whether we should do this at all.
So that's why I consider the framing effect the most dangerous bias in the world, right? Because it can send you to war remarkably easily. Now, the framing effect can also be used for good. There's an experiment where you have a picture of a senior citizen behind the wheel of a car and you ask an audience, should this person drive this car? And you get a policy debate. And some people are like, oh, old people are bad at everything. Don't let them drive. And other people are like, oh, that's ageist, type barrier. Let people do what they want. All you learn at the end of that conversation is who's on what side. Take the exact same photo, show it to another audience and ask, how might this person drive this car? And what you get is a bunch of people, a design discussion. Hey, what if we change the shape of the steering wheel? What if we move the dashboard, right? And what I'll learn by the end of that conversation is several different ways that person might be able to drive that car. I only changed 2 words, but by changing the frame of the conversation, I have changed the entire conversation. Like in politics today, you look at it and you watch, it is a framing war. Because if they can frame it, this was the one thing that Trump was a genius at, a dangerous, dangerous genius at. I say immigration, what's one of the first images that pops into your head? A wall. Not because a wall is integral to the discussion of immigration. It's largely immaterial. It's jumping to a approach, right, without even discussing the real needs or issues. But he made that association so common, he framed it as wall or no wall, not the millions of complex issues that actually go into immigration, right?
It also ignored the fact that boats and planes exist.
Yes, exactly. But it's basically sleight of hand. Don't look over here, look over here, right? But framing effect is hugely powerful and hugely impactful. And the reason it's actually the most dangerous bias in the world, it isn't just that the way I frame it, right, can lead you in one direction or another. We think we walk into a situation and decide what frame to put on when we look at it. The scary truth is we were already wearing the frame when we walked in the room. All of us already have all these frames that are already operating and we don't even know it. That's what makes it such a dangerous bias.
I've got a challenge for you to sort of fight this problem more. I really want to see you create this brand of condom called Frames, and like you sell different types, like 99% success rate, 1% failure, and one that's just like, this one works. Most times. This one works most times. Think of your brands and like
it works a lot.
Yeah.
So what's
I got to be in on a conversation about using framing positively with an organization that's working on immigration and actually did a whole bunch of research with focus groups on what kind of messages produce what kind of discussion among people. And they found that, talking about, the poor immigrants, like they're having such a hard time, did not work because most of the people responded by like, I'm having a hard time. I'm not going to care about them. I'm caring about me. All kinds of, things that we might typically feel would be an effective message. And what the framing that they found was actually super productive was to talk about feeling excluded and feeling like an outsider. And they took a room of people who were in a demographic that is typically very anti-immigrant and has a lot of bias towards, building a wall, keeping people out and saying, I don't like them. And they started the conversation just by saying, tell us about some times that you were excluded and felt like an outsider. And they went around the room and everybody said that. And then they said, imagine that you were in charge of the committee that welcomes new citizens. What would you do to make them feel included? in the country. And all of a sudden, these people are talking about all these ways to welcome people into the country and how to include people and integrate them. And it was just a completely different conversation.
Is that, David, also in some way an anchoring effect, that you're sort of creating an anchor to start? I guess I'd be curious about kind of the distinction between anchoring and framing.
Thing, right? Anchoring, priming. I mean, this is the super scary. Actually, there's an even scarier level we can get to if you like. But this is the almost totally scary level of the stuff you will do without realizing why you're doing it. So anchoring is this thing where I could say, hey, I want everybody to write down the last 2 numbers of your phone number. And then I could say, hey, we're going to bid on this bottle of wine. And those of you who wrote down a lower number are going to bid lower. Those who wrote down a higher number are going to bid higher. It's called anchoring, and it's a thing. And if I told you about it beforehand, you'd still do it. If I said, I will give you cash money not to do that, you'd still do it. It is super powerful. Or if we were in a meeting right now in an actual physical room, imagine that, and there was a briefcase visible in the room, we would all act more competitively than if it was right. Or if you go into a room and you can smell cleaning chemicals, you're more likely to pick up after yourself. This is the kind of shit I'm talking about, right?
It's like if you put pictures up in a store of faces that are looking at you, or just eyes in general, people are less likely to steal.
If you put googly eyes on a refrigerator, the common, if you've been in offices that have a common refrigerator, and you put googly eyes on it, people are less likely to steal your shit. Just googly eyes, not an actual face, just googly eyes.
That's good to know, because we have a friend. You guys all know who I'm talking about. Anyway, he puts googly eyes on a lot of things. And to my knowledge, none of those things have ever been stolen.
That's true. It'd be hard to steal an entire statue off of a ship, though.
I don't know which one you're talking about, because I have a bag of googly eyes right there.
You bring them on the Joe Cruise.
I'm not the guy you're talking about.
You're not as prolific as Keith Gibbs. You're definitely not as prolific as Keith.
But that notion of just setting the tone, especially in ways you don't realize you've said it, and it's absolutely powerful. I love that example. I love the "Don't mess with Texas" example. So y'all have heard the phrase "Don't mess with Texas"?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. All right. Do you know where it comes from?
Mm-hmm.
No.
But
it's from I used to live there, so it's about littering.
Yes, it was an anti-littering campaign.
Yeah. Oh, sorry about that. I didn't mean to thumbs up. I was thumbs upping to my mom.
Oh.
But now it just kind of comes in. Now it's just is a phrase that makes people
exactly. That's how powerful it was. Because this was, I think, the Texas highways, which were just a mess, right? And nothing was working. They rolled that out, and they managed to find the thing that people actually care about, just like they did with immigration. It's what do you actually care about? You care about not being excluded. What do you care about, Texans? That Texas is awesome. Mm-hmm. I don't care if you're red, blue, whatever. If you live in Texas, Texas is awesome. We all agree with that, right? And so to say littering is an affront to the great state of Texas, okay, guess what? People aren't going to litter them, right? But it's finding that common ground, finding that thing that you care about. I love this one. So Stacey Abrams tells a story about how there was going to be some anti-environmental law in Georgia the Republicans were trying to pass, and she got the Tea Party to shut it down. How did she do that? She did not go into the Tea Party and say, hey, climate change is real. She convinced them that property taxes were real. She knows that taxes, that is the issue with the Tea Party. They care about taxes. And she went in and said, hey, guess what happens to your property values if this erosion thing happens because of this law? And they're like, oh, all right. And they voted against the law. So it wasn't about her trying to convince my way is the right way and I'm a genius and you're idiots, which is frankly what most conservatives think, liberals think of them. It was saying, hey, I know you care about this. Let's talk about this, right? Same thing with the immigrants thing. I think that was brilliant. It's I know you care about not feeling excluded. Let's talk about what it feels like to feel excluded.
Stacey Abrams lady, she sounds like a good politician.
I'd keep an eye on her.
Yeah, she should be elected to some stuff.
She's going places.
Probably, yeah.
I want to make sure that we bring the framing thing to its full circle conclusion. So I have a question for Dave about this, but first I want to bring it to just in case this is still a little amorphous. Think about visual framing. right? Back when I was in college, I was studying some old newspapers to try to see how different newspapers framed different stories. You know, the same election, but different newspapers with different sort of political
I
biases.
took a college
made
course on exactly
different-
this.
This was cool. This was basically my entire major when I was in Australia.
I watched
And-
the movie version of Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky.
That's extremely helpful. That's big too. So the if you look, you could just look at the photos, right? And in one newspaper, you had so I was going back a ways, but this was former Prime Minister Keating, who was running for re-election, and in one newspaper there was this, you know, this close-up shot of him standing by a podium with his arm around his kid, and the word leader was above him on the stage, and it was a very, you know, it really framed him as he is the strong leader, he is protecting his kid and everyone's kids, and you know, here he is with this great, you know, he's the focal point of this picture, and he's taking up most of the frame. But in another newspaper that was in favor of Howard, who was running against him at the time and did ultimately win, that photo was not cropped. So you saw the whole stage, and the word that was above was actually leadership, and it was across the whole top of the photo, and you saw a very tiny Keating on this big empty stage next to a podium clutching his daughter under this word leadership, again, big black vacuum, like a leadership vacuum. This guy is too small, and it was the exact same photo. It was just a question of whether it was cropped or not. So then the question becomes, right, so that's a nice visual of how framing works in all of these kinds of different contexts. So David, you've mentioned that there is a way for those who speak other languages to break through this kind of effect. And I know we have a bunch of people who can speak some other languages here. Definitely in our audience we do. What can they do to try to knock out that 5% fat, 95% lean thing in their brains?
So yeah, that's interesting. With I would love to start thinking about how to do this visually, but when it comes to like decisions you have to make. So if you are bilingual, multilingual, and you try to think about the decision in your non-primary language, you are less likely to fall for the scam. So the example I give is I speak a little bit of French, and if I think about that beef decision in French, I have to think like, okay, beef, that's beef, that's a lot of L's. 95%, right? 89, right? Maybe. And by the time I've done all that processing, I see right through the scam, right? And there's a book by Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow. That's like the foundational work on cognitive bias. Like every episode of the podcast, I end up referencing it because it covers so much. And the basic premise of the book is there is system one thinking and system two thinking, right? And system one thinking is the part of your brain that's really good at looking at somebody and figuring out if they're angry, right? You can do that in a snap. It's really good at that quick process. System two thinking is what you use when someone says, what's 1072 times 576, right? You're not coming up with that a snap. You got to think about that, right? And when you are forced to think in your non-primary language, you're shifting more into that system two thinking where it's like, oh wait, okay, I gotta remember how words work again, right?
You make a really good point, because I just remembered how to say 95 in French. And I think it's 95. Like 95 doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it's saying 2815. Or 20, no, it's five, no, wait.
Four 420s.
Four
420s and 15. It's like the Gettysburg Address, just to say one number.
Why would anyone do that? Of course,
but you make a really good point, because I had to think about it and I slowed
instead
down.
of saying 10, 1, 10, 2, 10, 3, which is how some languages, we're like 11, 12, 13. Why? Just because.
French are right there with us, man.
No, I mean 11.
So you can flip it.
That's that. And I'd be curious to know, like, how do you slow down your visual thinking, right? So this is where we get into. I can't help, but I want to get into like the really, really scary brain shit. If you're up for it,
Yeah, do it. Let's do it.
Your brain fools you all the time, like at the speed of light. So I'm going to give you 3 examples that are scary as hell. First example, this goes back to framing. So I was talking to a guy who does AI research at Google and literally talking about pictures, right? And he is saying, okay, they've done, and this is before like Google, they've done experiments where they bring people in a room and they show them pictures from their childhood, except one of those pictures is fake, right? One of those pictures is them in a balloon, you know, with their dad or whatever, except they never went on a balloon ride with their dad. But they asked them about the pictures, and it's like, oh yeah, I remember that. And then they say, oh yeah, and I remember that. Yeah, it's funny. I'd forgotten about this, but yeah, I went on a balloon ride with my dad. No, they didn't. So you go to like sci-fi movies that are like, oh, they implanted memories, and they're like, whoa, that sounds scary. I'm glad we don't actually have that technology. No, we do, and I can do it with the photograph. All right, that's crazy brain thing.
Nope.
Crazy brain
Nope,
thing.
I gotta go.
You're out. Nope, no more. Crazy brain thing too. This is probably my favorite because you can like do this like experiment yourself. Touch your nose and your toe at the same time. You will feel it. You're doing it now. You feel it pretty much. You feel it at the same time. You shouldn't. The time it takes that impulse to go from your toe to your brain is just a little bit, millisecond longer than it takes to go from your nose to your brain. But what your brain does is say, okay, whoa, the nose impulse has arrived. Okay, hold up. Toe thing catches up. Okay, both of you come in.
But see, what if I bring my toe up to my nose?
That's not what he said. I thought
your toe, even if you touch your toe with your nose, you still shouldn't feel it at the same time.
It's funny because we've kind of already experienced that with something we did on New Year's Eve, which is
it wasn't drugs.
No, it wasn't drugs. It was just the fact that through enough tweaking of signals, we were able to play together remotely.
Oh, that's
yeah. Low latency music, right? Yeah, and the speed.
Mind you, it took an entire team of engineers tweaking all of our signals at the same time for that to happen.
See, your brain can do that shit without even thinking about it.
So, you know, the scary thing I want to ask is like about media consumption and how many like unconscious biases that media consumption can like input into us, and like what do you think is there a line there? Or is it just like a matter of when I think about my favorite TV shows, I should just start thinking about them in Spanish or something?
That's a good question. All of them. I mean, when I think about media consumption, I really think about as pattern recognition. Like I come back to that pattern recognition, like because part of the long game is going to be not just I'm going to put all these design interventions in there that I'm going to like curb some of these biases or take away the name off a resume. Like that's good and all, but like long term, I need you to have a different pattern, right? I shouldn't have to pretend I'm someone else to get a job. I shouldn't have to hide who I am to get a job. I have to for now because you've got this pattern. But if you had a different pattern, maybe it would be different. That's why I consider Obama's biggest achievement as president was to be black and president at the same time. Because up until then, if you saw black people on the nightly news, they were either celebrities or criminals. And I'm convinced that part of the reason the Black Lives Matter movement came along when it did wasn't because that was when cops started shooting black people. They'd been doing that for a while. I'm convinced part of the reason it had an impact then was because white people had a different pattern for what black could mean. And so beforehand, when white cops were shooting black people, it was like, well, yeah, of course, they're criminals. That's the pattern, right? It's like they didn't shoot Prince, so he must have been a criminal, right? But all of a sudden, one of the patterns for what black meant every single night on the nightly news was president of America, the most powerful person on the planet, right? You're actually hijacking a very old pattern for what the president means, which is a big fucking deal, and saying, oh, but he's black now. And so you are forced now to start to associate black with everything you love about America. Right? And all of a sudden, when a black guy gets shot by the cops, like, what? Oh, wait, is that right? Should they be doing that? Right? Do Black Lives Matter? Maybe, right? You know.
But you're making me think though that Megyn Kelly is going to come in and be like, okay, well, you can challenge our assumption on president, but you'll never take Santa Claus. Santa Claus will always be white.
I think there's another pattern recognition.
So they had severe overcorrection following Obama.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, people weren't happy about it.
No. But Black Lives Matter has another pattern recognition element, I think, which is the fact that we all have cameras now, and it's so easy to share the images of police abusing their power and shooting people who are not a threat, which certain communities we're seeing happen all the time, and other communities were completely not seeing that. We're kind of shielded from that, and it's the fact that people that traditionally weren't the kind of people that would see that ever have now seen that in a series of repetitions that changes their pattern of recognition, which previously would have been like, oh, the pattern is the police are justified because my experience with the police is that they've been protecting me and they've been blah, blah, blah. But to have that pattern disrupted with a new pattern of police often, don't act justifiably and are trying to not de-escalate the situation and stuff, so that the interpretation of these events starts to become different.
And adding to that the thing that then set the video of George Floyd's death apart was the perspective, and I heard this from my mother-in-law, but that so many of these videos are from the perspective of like the cop, if it's a body cam. Mm-hmm. So you see what the cop sees, so you're already empathizing with the cop, like, oh, okay, this is what he sees. Oh, wow, this is a scary situation. Okay, all right. But then to have that flipped around and see like, oh, wow, here's this guy kneeling on this guy and killing him, and here you get to see his face. Like, you get to see his expression and actually see like, whoa, holy shit. And that maybe was part of why initially the reaction was so strong and galvanizing, and then maybe ultimately the verdict going the way that it did.
And it also maybe has a bit of an element. Sorry, Dolia. I was just gonna say it also maybe has a bit of an element of that. What was it? Rework, or that thing made by the 14-year-old Rethink, right? Where it's basically like, this is happening. Are you sure you're okay with this? In a way that a sort of additional check that was not previously available to a lot of people readily.
Yeah, if you had to look at it, if you had to see it happen, are you sure you're okay with this?
Dolio, I'm sorry, what were you saying?
But it also helped that George Floyd was well known amongst the black community before this happened. We knew him as Big Floyd before all of this happened. So I feel like the fact that he was already like a well-known figure in underground hip hop helped the case of him getting justice.
So here's the thing. I'm old enough to remember the video of Ronnie Kane.
Oh my God, you're so old.
And we had him dead to rights, and it didn't mean shit.
Right.
And I thought about that a lot on the day the verdict came down. Because I'm also old enough to remember when the verdict came down for those cops. And it didn't mean shit. And LA riots, right? So I don't think it's just about the video. Yeah, there's more of it now. Honestly, I think part of the difference is that in the 80s, with some notable exceptions, there was a middle class. White people were comfortable. They were making more money than their parents did. And capitalism was not letting them down. It was keeping them safe. And yeah, maybe the cops were beating up this one black guy who probably deserved it. But for the most part, yeah, I'm fine. Fast forward to now, and you've had 2 generations in a row where even the white kids were making less money than their parents. And they are working jobs with no health care, right? And they're just this much closer to living like black, right? Powers that be forgot to dole out the whiteness. 2 generations. So now you've got 2 generations worth of people saying, well, what has capitalism done for me lately? Do I really need to care about that? And these other people who are getting shot, am I more like them than I am like the people who were shooting them? Maybe, right? And that's why I think that we start to see things that people openly questioning capitalism. Like, again, I'm an old fart. Back in my day, you didn't do that. The people who were against capitalism were an ocean away putting nuclear missiles at us. You did not question capitalism. And again, there was still a middle class. It was actually doing pretty well for folks. Now you get to the point where it's like, well, what has capitalism done for me lately? Maybe socialism, a little bit, maybe, right? And someone like AOC, who is openly supported and funded by the Democratic Socialist Party of Brooklyn, literally in the name, right? 10 years earlier, that would have killed her career. Now it's like, that actually lends her some credibility, right? Because remember, she had to beat an incumbent Democrat who's like, been there for decades, right? So I think that, as much as anything else, also factored into why you're starting to see people, white people, saying Black Lives Matter. Because like they are, going back to that notion of they know what it's like to feel excluded, not to the extent of having to worry about the cops shooting them all the time, but certainly to the extent of being like, I don't know if the cops make me feel safe.
But I will say, though, that, I mean, it's cool that AOC is in Congress, but I mean, you can't really tell based on Congress, because they have a congressperson backed by DSA and they have a congressperson backed by QAnon. So,
yeah, and that's the trade-off, right? That's the trade-off of saying, I don't just want lawyers in Congress, right? You can get a Cori Bush in there, someone who knows what it's like to be pepper sprayed by the cops, someone who knows what it's like to have COVID while running for Congress without health care. I want those people in there. But if those people are going to be in there and we're looking outside of just white male in Yale, guess what you're also going to get? Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Right. I personally, I feel more comfortable voting for someone who's been broke before, rather than someone who's been wealthy their whole lives, or someone who's been a politician their entire lives, or someone who comes from a family of politicians.
Well, and in part that goes back to the whole no growth without resistance, right?
Exactly.
I mean, that's America 101. What even remotely good thing in America has happened without a ton of bloodshed?
A ton. Right. You don't get the 8-hour workday without bloodshed. You don't get the 40-hour work week without bloodshed. You don't get insurance without. You don't get safe food to eat without.
You don't get scum crust.
And what terrible thing in America hasn't come without a paycheck.
Right.
Right. Without a serious payday for someone.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's this question. I was listening to this podcast, Through Line, and for the past 2 episodes, at the end of it, they asked, what do you think capitalism means to you? And I've been thinking about that a lot and have my own little definition, but I want to pose that question to you, David. Given what you just said, what does capitalism mean to you?
So I was doing a workshop and I asked folks, actually in between the breaks, it just came up and I was like, what? Define business. And we asked them, and this one person was just simple, straightforward definition was like, exchanging money for goods and services. And I'm like, that doesn't seem evil. And when I think about when it starts to go wrong, I start to think about, okay, you want a hammer? I've got a hammer. You give me money, I give you the hammer. We're fine. Someone looks at that and says, hey, you know what? I bet you he sells 10 hammers this week, right? Someone says, I'll take that bet. And someone's looking at them and says, you know what? I bet you that guy makes good that bet that guy's going to make 10 hammers. Someone else says, I'll take a piece of that action. Do that 5 more times. All of a sudden, there's more money around the buying and the selling of the hammer than there actually is in that hardware store.
And right? I bet he goes out of business. How about that? How about that guy?
Well, if I have enough money, I can bet both ways.
Right.
That's exactly what happened. All right,
That's where you get options.
What's that?
That's where you get options trading.
Let me tell you a story that, like, oh my God, sums up America so beautifully. So I'm reading The Half Has Not Been Told, which is an incredible, super depressing, but super well-written book about the economics of slavery, right? And the economic story of slavery, which, like, literally the half hasn't been told. You don't understand just how fundamental slavery was to, like, the economy. Like, we do not get America without it. You just don't. It just doesn't happen. Like, cotton was like oil. And it was a worldwide thing. Most of the cotton that we sold went to Britain. 80% went to Liverpool to be turned into actual thread. So 1830s, slavery is doing great. someone says, you know what we could do? I'm going to create this thing called a mortgage-backed security. It's this brand new invention, right? The mortgage is a slave, right? It's someone saying, hey, I'm going to borrow a bunch of money to buy a bunch of slaves, and they'll work my land, and I'll make a lot of money, and I'll pay you back that loan, right? I'm taking out a mortgage, not on a house, but on a bunch of slaves. And someone says, okay, I'm going to take a whole bunch of those mortgages, turn them into tranches. Is this starting to sound familiar yet? And I'm going to sell those. And I'm going to sell them all over the world. There's people in France and England buying up these mortgage-backed securities made up of slaves. What happens next? What always happens when you build a bubble? Eventually, cotton's prices start going down because people can only get so much cotton before like, okay, we've got enough cotton already, Jesus. And the price of cotton goes down, so the price of slaves goes down. And the only difference between the bubble bursting with slaves and the bubble bursting with the housing market is that instead of bailing out like the banks, because they weren't really banks, instead of bailing out the banks, what happens is the people who owe the money when it comes time to pay just say no. And there's a phrase, GTT, gone to Texas. At the time, Texas was still an independent republic. And the people who owed the money on their slaves in Mississippi and all these other places said, while no one's looking, we're just going to fuck off to Texas and take our slaves with us. And that's why Texas became a huge slave state, because there was a bunch of people running from the other slave states to have a place to have their slaves and not owe any money on them. That is the most perfectly American story I can possibly fucking imagine, right? Because it's saying, I'm taking this thing that's already horrible and cruel and exploitative, but you know what? It's just not making enough money.
Damn, dude.
And it kind of deconstructs a little bit, like, you know, we're sort of talking about capitalism, but we're also sort of talking about not the way it's supposed to work on paper, but more the way that it really works, which is
it's the way that it works when you don't. It goes back to the whole, like, I'm getting fuzzy, but it goes back to the whole like first brain, second brain thing, right?
Yeah.
You just let your biases run free, and you don't ever take time out to use system two. Okay. There's a thing called the, what is it called? Affine model, AFFINE. And it's supposed to basically mathematically model out inequality, basically. Sort of say, okay, what are the different elements? Sorry, I'm trying to get back into focus again. Okay, what are the different elements that like go in? So they basically have a bunch of bots, and the bots just do trades, right? They just say, hey, I want to buy this from you, I'm going to buy it, and there's going to be an exchange of wealth, like just little exchanges of wealth, just like the guy buying the hammer. Right? No one's betting on anything. It's just exchanges of wealth. And you get like 1 million of them, and they just do trades, and you just have them run. In a perfectly equal system, right? Nobody's trying to game the system. Nobody's trying to take advantage of anybody. Inevitably, mathematically, all the money ends up with one bot. If you let it run long enough, that's just math. Even if everyone were perfectly ethical in a purely free market, zero regulation, you will inevitably mathematically end up with just one person with all the money.
Wow.
So regulation, we actually know how to do this. This is not like, that's the thing about all this stuff. And the thing that actually makes me a little hopeful, like these are not unsolvable problems, right? There was a time when if a bank, in America, where if a bank failed, the people who made it fail went to jail. They didn't get to keep the bank. There was a time where if a company tried to come into town, undersell everybody because they had a whole bunch of venture capital and could afford to sell their stuff for cheaper, and run all the mom and pop businesses out of business, and then say, okay, we can jack our prices up now. This is what A&P used to do. It was illegal. They got shut down. They're doing exactly what Walmart does now, but then it was illegal, right? It's a thing that America is actually capable of. And at the time, like that was just the frame, right? Because we had just gone out of World War II, and we had a pretty clear picture of what happens when you consolidate power. We were super suspicious of it, right? So we actually had this sort of notion of, oh yeah, we really don't like people amassing power, whether it's financial power or whatever. Then you get into another frame, right? The go-go 60s and 70s and 80s. And it's like, oh, you know what would be much more fun? Deregulation. And it was even Carter who actually began the deregulation. Reagan took it to a whole other level, but even by the time he gets to Carter, he's already starting to deregulate shit. So, oh my God, it's just, yeah. But that's the thing. We are capable of having capitalism where it's working fine because we're not making it more important than human rights, Like, it's not rocket science, right? There's a version of capitalism where like, yeah, I write books and people like the book and I sell the book. That's great. I get to have a nice home and I get to talk about things that are important to me and people get to read about things they like. That's a fair exchange. It's when we start getting into like, yeah, but what if we could like, have a slave write the book? Or what if we could like, have a platform where if you want to read the book, you have to pay me a license. And then you have to, every time you want to read the book, you have to pay that license. Wouldn't that be more fun for me to make money off of, right? It's just when you get greedy, that's when it gets fucked up.
At the same time, I think you have to approach the parts that are rocket science, because for a lot of people, it's so counterintuitive that the math just leads to one bot having all the money. And that's kind of a complex idea to get your mind around. Or the idea that the capitalist system is more than just exchanging goods for money is more nuanced that you have to wrestle with. And as long as the conversation is stuck at the simple level of, oh, it's the freedom to exchange goods for money, and that's unbiased and doesn't lead to the accumulation of power, there's going to be a bias towards just saying, oh, it'll work.
Yeah, it's worth understanding, right, that capitalism is not merely sort of a glorified barter system, but it actually fundamentally has to do with the private ownership of the means of production. The idea that, like, I'm going to own the plant that produces the stuff, and then, like, that has to introduce, like, some inherent inequality, because then you got to go to me, and you got to buy it from me, and I'm going to accumulate more wealth and power that way. But
I think that's the. Oh.
I just want to jump on top of that real quick, because sometimes I think, like, when it comes to something becoming a public-private utility, like, if someone gets big enough, they should become a public utility, or they should just be incorporated into the government. Like, say how Amazon works. I mean, first of all, that's a fucked up business, and how they run their business is super fucked up. But they're so big, and their distribution network is so big and so useful. I really think that's something that, like, in a more thought out world, I think that they would just be incorporated into the U.S. postal system and somehow, and we could take advantage of that network, and we'd be like, we pay Bezos off, like, you get this much, and then you might have to start a different business to get as much money as, like, he currently has in this weird ass reality.
Or maybe they could stop sending like a tube of toothpaste in a 2 foot by 3 foot box.
The solution to that comes from XKCD.
It's reductio ad absurdum, because sure, you can talk about the complexity. You can look at the complexities of any system. So first of all, to that complexity shit. Look, at the end of the day, children love the complexity, right? Because children have no problem with exploring, right? Children have no problem. And exploration is the best way to handle. I just watched Kathy Sierra, internet legend, give her first talk in maybe 15 years. She was doxxed way back then for literally being a woman talking about things intelligently in tech, and had disappeared from the scene for, like, I think almost 15, 20 years. She came back literally the first time she's ever spoken. I saw her like hours ago, and she gave this just mind-blowing mic drop of a talk. But that basically dealt with this notion of emergence, right? And this idea that really complex things, the way to actually teach a robot how to walk, like all these interesting things benefit from things like novelty and not just narrowing your choices and having, this is the objective, so I'm going to narrow you to that objective. So, long story short, instead of recommendation engines, you really should have exploration engines that are moving me away from what I already know, right? So that level of complexity is something that's basically called playful learning. Like, it's play. That's the best, one of the most powerful ways to learn, especially if you're trying to learn about a complex system, right? Is to play in it, right? I do a lot of thinking about systems storytelling because, yeah, if you don't understand systems, you're going to get fucked. So, but it's really hard to tell a story about a system. It's much easier to tell a story about an individual. But games are actually awesome at telling stories about systems, right? Like, how freaking complex is Minecraft? How freaking complex is, like, the worlds of some of these MMORPGs? So yeah, I think that if you can introduce that approach to some of these more complex things, it isn't as scary. It's actually kind of fun. But to the idea of, like, I think it's more than just, oh, it's too complicated. I think sometimes that is deliberate obfuscation of financial instruments, right? I want this to seem complicated because I only want me and my buddies to play, right? That trope goes way back, right? And I think you can point to things like DuckDuckGo. Do yourself a favor and read or watch Gabe Weinberg's testimony before the Senate. Gabe Weinberg's the guy who founded DuckDuckGo. I actually interviewed him for a web series I did back in the day. Great guy, and he was an angel investor saying all this too. And I remember even then he was like, oh yeah, people should really watch out for VC because the second you take VC, you lose control. And this was the guy who was an angel investor saying that shit. It's like, watch out for me, right? But he testifies before Congress. DuckDuckGo is a search engine that basically doesn't track it doesn't record anything about you or your searches. Doesn't give a fuck. If you search for shoes, it'll serve you some ads for shoes, but that's it. It's not going to try to guess who you are or where you are or learn So he goes before Congress and he says, okay, look, DuckDuckGo was GDPR compliant before there was GDPR. It's California regulations compliant before there were ever California regulations. Because that's how I wanted it to be. I wanted it to be ethical. And guess what? I'm making, dollars over dollars, right? It's not $1 billion industry. It's not so much money that if he lost $1 billion every day for the rest of his life, he'd still be rich. Literally Jeff Bezos. No, but this kid's going to go to college. He's going to live in a nice home, right? And it's a multi-million-dollar business, right? And there are many more like this. Dan Price, right? Making, good money at a very ethically run business, right? And he's not making 300 times what his cheapest employee is. And not for nothing, but the companies that have a smaller gap there do better. They perform better on the S&P 500. So I think that there is some degree of, yes, complexity there, but there's some degree of performative complexity that I think is there to make it okay for me to make a ridiculous amount of money with zero accountability. And I think if we start to layer in that accountability as you go over a certain amount, which again, this country used to do, tax base over a certain amount was 90% in the frickin' 50s when the country was literally the biggest exporter on the planet, right? 90%. So we know how to do that, but it's the political will. It's more, I think, than the complexity. It's the political will.
There's a question of identity too. I think nationally, when you talk about regulation, it kind of gets back to this fundamental idea of liberty and freedom. That America is about.
Ain't right, America.
Well, yeah, America is about what we can do, what we want to do. We have a Statue of Liberty, and there was Viktor Frankl was quoted as when he came to America and he saw the statue, and they were like, "How do you like the Statue of Liberty? It's so cool, right?" And he was like, "Yeah, it's very cool." And I assume on the West Coast you have a Statue of Responsibility. There is not that, but there should be. I think that even this identity that we have as our nation, that freedom, unregulated freedom, that's what we do, and we don't think about it, but all those times when we have regulation, that's actually extremely important.
And there's probably abundance of movies that foretell a scorched earth dystopia.
Yeah,
that's the end result of unlimited freedom.
Yeah,
and that's the thing that look.
Could we say that the West Coast currently, as it is infrastructurally, is a testament to irresponsibility?
Well, it's not the only part of the country.
Sure.
You're right. Everything west of the Statue of Liberty could be that.
Yeah.
Look, Texas grid is the perfect example of you get what you pay for, right?
Yeah.
We are going to have liberty. We're not going to be on the federal grid. We're going to live off the grid, right? Okay, great. Guess what happens when your shit goes down?
Right.
We literally can't help you.
Because they also use that liberty to not adhere to, safety regulations or preventative regulations that would have allowed them to be prepared for that, And then they end up relying on, myths like wind turbines don't work in cold weather. Then how do you explain Norway?
I know, seriously, man. I've been up in I took the train up to you can't not see a windmill up there.
When I'm reading this Weinberg testimony, it's great stuff. It's really fantastic, and it's moral and it's principled, and I wonder if that's necessarily enough. Sometimes I don't know, it sort of reminds me of like Mr. Rogers testifying about like getting his funding for PBS, which is also a great watch if people can watch that. But it sort of makes that question of like what argument do you need to make, when you're testifying in a context like this? Like, are you trying to appeal to emotion? Are you trying to appeal to saying it's the right thing to do? Or are you trying to say like, look, you're still going to make just as much money? And he actually makes a bunch of these points.
I don't actually know what he was being called to testify on. I like to think that they just like called him just to be like, hey, what's up? And he was like, oh, nothing much, by the way, right? But like whenever you ask like what's the argument to make, you have to ask yourself what's the goal. Like if he's there to convince Congress to pass some kind of regulatory thing, then he has to sort of figure out. I mean, at the end of the day, I don't like convincing people. I don't think convincing works per se. I like understanding. I like agreeing on a goal and trying to figure out how to get to that goal. That interests me. I had someone who wrote me after a talk I gave and saying like, we're totally diametrically opposed. Iron sharpens iron. Let's have basically let's fight. And I'm like, no. It's like, it sounds exhausting. And it doesn't sound like either of us are really like, you might be spoiling for a fight and you might enjoy it. I don't enjoy that. I just don't. Like, I like saying, let's first do the hard work and figure out what we want, which is a lot harder than you think. And then once we figure out what we want, if we can do that, the better we can do that, the more easier everything else is. Erica Hall is a genius, and she's been doing design for a while and research for a while, and she's come to the conclusion that like all the brainstorming in the world don't mean shit. What you really need to get good at is asking the right question. If you can ask the right question, you're 95% of the way there. If you frame the question correctly, you've actually done most of the work. The rest of it will be much easier. What most people do is come up with a half-assed question and waste time, right? They say, how can we make as much money as possible? And you waste time filling a void that, as we were discussing earlier, even once you've made all that money, you're not happy. So you were asking the wrong question. Like Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote a piece where he's talking about the two things you can check off on a census to make you the most likely to commit suicide are white and male. And he was writing about how white male privilege doesn't even work. All the trouble it causes, and it doesn't even work. People still kill themselves, right? So they were asking the wrong question. So what interests me is saying, okay, how do we get to the right question? You do that, you are so much further along than trying to convince somebody of something.
Can I take a guess at the right question? Can I take a guess at the right question? I would probably say, do you want cheese on that?
That is a wonderful question. And the answer is always yes.
Omelette du fromage?
And I mean, about the framing too, like maybe this is relevant, but like it looks like the hearing that he was testifying was specifically about GDPR and CCPA and the effects on competition and innovation. So there's kind of the question is already framed very much like we're assuming that this stuff will have an impact on, and what we're saying we value is competition and innovation. So, is that going to be a good impact? But we're assuming it will be an impact. So his voice was, I'm sure, a really helpful one.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about helpful. I have no idea if they listened to him, but it was an awesome voice.
To jump off of that statement on like, all these white guys feeling so bad that they do something pretty terrible, even though, they have all this power in the world. One thing I worry about in the Black universe is sometimes our business structures imitate those old business structures a lot. And I'm not sure how Greenwood Bank is innovating the game and becoming something different than just another bank. But I worry about that as we're encouraging more people of color to be heads of businesses. Are we creating businesses that are really innovative, or are we just mimicking what people have done before? Are we just putting different guards at the post?
That keeps me up at night. So there was one of the okay, let me tell you why I'm still on Clubhouse. I'm still on Clubhouse because every now and then there was a conversation like the one I saw called "Can Black Capitalism Exist?" I have not seen that conversation on any other platform, and it was a doozy. and it was rough.
I want to be there.
I'm like, I don't know. I really don't know. So I was having a conversation with someone who's talking about how like most fights against oppression have two tracks. One track is dealing with the existing institution and getting into those institutions. So think about the Oscars. Like it's a big fucking deal that Chloe Zhao won that Oscar, right? First woman of color in history, and movies have been around for 120 years. At the same time, there's another track that's like, well, fuck that. Let's build our own institutions. Who needs the Oscars? No one watches those movies anyway. Let's make our own shit, right? And you see like all this incredible progress and innovation there, right? And I feel like both need to exist because you can't pretend history isn't there and these things don't already exist and exert influence. But at the same time, you can't pretend that those things are fair and right and should exist forever as they are, and that you don't need that it's about assimilating into and getting legitimized by those things. It's also about having your own blackness, womanness, intersectionality represented in its own way. And that, you know what it is? I need to research more because I want to understand what non-colonized business looks like. Because again, business is a tool. It is there to solve a problem. It is there to, and I think we still don't even ask that question. Like what problem does business solve? It provides resources for people, resource distribution. Okay, if that's actually the problem solving. Okay, what are non-colonist ways? Another way of me saying, okay, let us go to places in Africa that are not influenced by colonialism, which good luck, but there's a few, and talk about, or go back before colonialism and say, well, how did people get shit done? Did they do business? Was it just, in which case it's like, business isn't white, it's universal. Or this is European business, but this is how Africans accomplish the same things independent of that. And you have options. And you don't have to say our only choice is to be poor or be white, right? That I agree that you don't want that box. You don't want those choices. What you want to know is what are we trying to solve for? Again, what is the goal? What is the question we're trying to answer? Is it we want to know how we can be rich? Is that it? Is it we want to know how we can support each other? Is that like, let's figure out what the question is first before we say, well, the only way to do that is capitalism.
We all want to jump in on this.
Yeah. one of the helpful parts of what you just said, I think, comes to deconstructing whiteness. Because when you're talking about, a situation where somebody says, well, I have two choices, be poor or be white, I mean, there exist, for instance, poor white people, but, it might be helpful if they sort of looked at this model of whiteness and instead of clinging to it said, well, this doesn't really serve me. Like it's not a beneficial thing to be considered white. Like what is the, I'm not expressing this well, but just sort of deconstructing the whole idea of like white as an identity as opposed to white as sort of a confluence of like a system of promoting power that ultimately revolves around supporting a small group of people in power, which wasn't exactly the point you were getting at, but it's always interesting when whiteness is able to be just a little bit deconstructed.
This everything you were saying, just like it, I'm really excited about that frontier of thought that we're getting at, because I was reading this book. I got this book from my grandparents for my birthday, and it's pretty good. And it's called Blue Ocean Strategies. It came out, I think, over a decade ago. And it's basically talking about looking for non-competitive markets. And when you're talking about like what does a different sort of business look like, I do believe that's one of the ways to start. You finding a place where you're not competing. And another like little theory I'm playing with is like maybe businesses or business structures aren't necessarily a way need to be framed in making money, but a way of communicating. And how are you being careful, and how are you being considerate in the way you communicate in a business structure? So if you research more on this, let's talk.
I mean, I've been thinking a lot about decentering money in whether you want to call it business. At that point, you can't really call it capitalism because capital is literally at the center. If you just want to call it business, right? Because socialists like money too. Just let you know. Actually, I have a friend, Mike Monteros, is like, socialists love money. They just disagree on how to distribute it. But if decentering money from that whole equation, and again, getting back to like the hammer, right? That transaction isn't happening because somebody loves hammers. That transaction is happening is because someone wants to put a picture on a wall, or someone wants to build a house, right? There's something other than the money. Here's the thing. There's always something other than the money. It's never about the money. The money is a means to an end.
Placeholder.
Whenever I work with people where we're going to do a project and I have to get down to, okay, what is the goal of this project, right? It can't just be money, right? There's a reason you chose to make money this way, right? If you're in pharmaceuticals, if you're in, but the only like business where you can there's only two businesses where you can legitimately tell me it's about the money, because these are, I think, the two most profitable things you can do in the world, where there's literally, you are going to make the most money. Drug dealing and hedge funds. If you're a drug dealer and you tell me it's all about the money, I believe you. Like the profit margin on drugs is it's ridiculous, right? And hedge funds, like you get, it's a little more input, but you're not the payout is just, it's, unless it's one of those two things, there's got to be more to it, right? And not to get too armchair psychologist, I will bet you dollars to donuts it is your parents. Something that happened in your childhood, I will draw a straight fucking line to, and you ended up here, and you ended up pursuing money because of that. I mean, how many people have deconstructed Trump's psyche based on his dad? And how many of them are probably fucking right?
I mean, Woody Guthrie said it. Woody Guthrie was right.
What did Guthrie say?
Oh, he wrote a
Trump's
song
father
called,
in the 40s.
He wrote a song.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Old Man Trump.
I'll tell you, here's a fun fact. People go back. People go back to if I had a time machine, I'd go back and kill Hitler. Try killing Hitler's dad. Hitler's dad beat him almost to death. You think that didn't have a little bit of influence?
Then
all I
again,
got to say to that.
he managed to rally, a lot of a country. So,
And what do you think their dads were like?
Right, it's not just one dad. Exactly, there's a whole culture. Like seems like it was pretty easy to get them to believe and do what they believed and did.
Right, and just like it wasn't totally about Hitler. It wasn't totally about Trump either. Because
no,
it was
there's
just
70 million Trump voters.
Right. It's like
after they had 4 years of Trump, said more, please.
Yeah, he's out of office now, but.
Yeah, he is not the problem. He's not the car. He's the hood ornament. And you can replace that hood ornament with something shinier that would be more effective.
Do
He's just the most recent iteration of that.
I'm just armchair. I'm getting in my armchair too, but do you think all the tough dads from the World War II era are the reason why we got so much deregulation in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s?
You mean the so-called greatest generation?
That whole book.
The same greatest generation that fought alongside my great-grandfather, who came back from fighting for his country and fighting fascism to only encounter fascism when he got back.
Okay, so here's
alongside.
Here's an unpopular theory. All right, the Democrats signed their own death warrant by tolerating the racism of FDR and the Greatest Generation.
Yes.
Because when I was talking about AMP getting shut down, the banks getting shut down, they literally called them FDR Democrats, right? This was a vein of democracy, of democraticness that understood that there was an alignment between social justice and finance, that you couldn't decouple the two. By the time you get to, this is one guy calls them Watergate babies. Time to get to that sort of era. All the old FDR Democrats are considered old and racist and stupid. And the focus shifts from like sort of finance to consumer interest, and make sure that milk is cheap, make sure that people can afford eggs. Here's the thing. Walmart milk is cheap, and you can do all sorts of unethical shit with business. The idea was you stayed away from business. Just let business is business. Let business do its thing. Just focus on making sure that people have, the basic fairness, basic things they need, right? And they decoupled finance from social justice. And they basically and that leads to, that's what I was saying, Carter started deregulating. Before we get to Reagan, Reagan seizes on that shit, but it's actually Carter who starts pulling away some of that regulation because we had lost the thread of the regulation actually helps social justice. And part of the reason people flocked away and were willing to move away from business is because unions were racist.
Yeah.
It's all business. Like all of that stuff was kind of painted with the same brush of being like, no, this is, and FDR shit was racist too, right? Like the, fucking GI Bill, all that stuff. Like we came back and it's like, some people did better, right? But had that been handled better, had that been handled fairly, I predict, you would have seen a bunch of black voters who weren't fucked over and actually had the right to vote, right? And you would have had less hypocrisy for Republicans to run against, right? And the whole Southern strategy starts to fall apart because there's actually some black power there, right? So, yeah, I think the reason that you saw that deregulation wasn't necessarily strong, dads coming back from World War II so much was as a racist country saying, okay, everybody come back. No, you not so fast.
Right. Yeah.
I find it
you have
interesting
the Black
about
Power
that.
movement because you have people who went over there, experienced being treated like humans. They came back and were like, you know what? I don't think I'm going to tolerate this anymore.
I am still
Back.
still befuddled by there are certain moments in human history where slaves were offered freedom from the British during the Revolutionary War. Germans were trying to get people to come over to black soldiers to come over to their side during World War I. And to some extent too, although they were pretty clear on their opinion of Schwarz's. And after the internment camps, war was still going on. And there were Japanese Americans who had been in the internment camps who fought tooth and nail to get let back into the army to fight for the country that had imprisoned them against their, I won't say home country, but their ancestors. That blows my mind because whenever I think about those situations, I think to myself, the first thing I'm going to do the second I get out of this internment camp is go the fuck back to Japan. I'm getting the hell out of here. Fuck this place. But time and again, people who have been oppressed by this country have fought for it. And to me, that is the resiliency of the American idea. Now, with black people, I think it's a special case because we literally built the thing. You're not going to make us leave after we build it. Fuck that. And again, one of those little secret histories, and I wish I could have been a fly on the wall for this meeting. Abraham Lincoln's already signed the Emancipation Proclamation. He has this whole plan in his head. He's going to, get rid of slavery. And he brings these black leader abolitionists into his office. And he's like, okay, here's the plan. I'm going to free the slaves. And they're like, yeah. And he's like, and then I'm going to send all the black people back to Africa. And I cannot tell you how much money I would pay to see the look on their faces. What do you do? Do you lose your shit? Do you just sort of okay, tell me more, right? Because here's the thing, and this is a key difference. This is a key distinction I think we really need to start getting our heads around. There is a difference between hating white people and loving black people. Lincoln truly hated slavery. He thought it was a moral affront. He did not really like black people. He thought if black people stayed in the country after slavery, it would be disruptive. They didn't belong. He didn't want them there. There is a difference between loving black people and hating racism. And I think that's what we're starting to see with performative allyship, white fragility, right? because there's a lack of curiosity. This, I think, kind of comes back to a lot of what we're talking about here. There's a lack of curiosity in white fragility. There's a lack of curiosity in performative allyship. It is much more focused on, please don't yell at me.
Yeah.
Like, if you want to talk about goals, what are you trying to achieve? I'm trying to achieve feeling good about myself and being able to feel good about myself. And you bring up all these things my ancestors done. It doesn't make me feel very good about myself. Tell me, what is the bare minimum I can do to make you say I'm good? I want you to tell me I'm one of the good ones and that I'm okay. That it's okay for me to feel good about myself, right? And I'll cop to this, right? Like, my privilege is being male. And I have had it way easier than women have. Certainly women of color, right? There's a reason a black man got elected before a white woman, because women hadn't even had the vote for 100 years yet. They literally just had it for 100 years. We were property and we got the vote first, all right? So even I have to get out of that box of, oh, please, women, don't yell at me. Please say I'm one of the good guys, right? Not all men, hashtag, right? And get into that space of curiosity of saying, what the fuck is happening? I want to understand what the hell's actually happening, right? And I want to understand where we're trying to go. And to go back to therapy, like, one of the key lessons for me for therapy was I had been outsourcing my self-worth for 40 years, and it wasn't going well. It's not the sort of thing you want to outsource. And my therapist helped me go from a place of, am I a good person or am I a bad person? And literally making every interaction about, am I a good person or a bad person? That's exhausting and dangerous. And instead went to a place of, what are your values? I mean, no, really, just write them down. What do you actually believe? What are your values? Okay, now let's make it about your proximity to them. Are you closer to that one today than you were yesterday? Are you further away? And again, going back, now we're out of binary thinking. Now we're just thinking about, here's what you believe in, and you're either closer to it or you're further away from it. And that's it. You're never there. You're never a good person. You're never a bad person. You're either closer to or further away from what you believe in. And that, to me, that is what the only thing I can possibly think of in terms of, like, why do people who have been oppressed by America keep coming back to it, is because America is a value. It is actually a really great fucking idea if you ever actually did it. And so it's worth fighting for. It's worth trying to get closer to. And I am not even a little bit interested in white people fretting over whether or not they're good or bad people, or fretting over whether or not they're racist. I honestly don't want to hear if you're racist or not. And I'm not going to give you my opinion if you're racist. I don't give a shit. What I want to know is, white America, what are your values? And tell me if you're getting closer to them or further away. That's the conversation, right? That's the conversation that's going to save my life.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good negotiation tactic as well. There's a book I read called Getting More. In that book, it frames successful negotiations around getting the party with whom you are negotiating with closer to whatever they think they are in this, assessment of their values, and measuring them against that. So if they make a decision or take an action that you feel is not fair, don't frame it as something as being as unfair to you. Frame it as being something that doesn't align itself with the way they value themselves, or what values or whatever image of themselves that they've already put out into the world. Does this align itself with the way you portray yourself to be? I mean, if you portray yourself to be a scoundrel and then you behave as a scoundrel, then, there's not much negotiation that happens. But if you portray yourself to be this moral paragon, then you violate that.
Yeah.
It makes a person sit back and make some sort of an assessment.
By the way, I just got to throw in that, David, you put that so beautifully. Just like, put that in a soup, man.
Definitely want you on my team. And I happen to know that you're nearby. Once things are opened up, you come to the
Where are you at? Yeah.
I'm in Philly.
Oh, nice. We're in Philly.
Yeah, South Philly, Bella Vista by the Italian market.
Oh, yeah, awesome. Yeah, I'll totally hook up once everything's not crazy.
We go awesome block parties.
Block parties.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, let me know when there's another block. Like when we actually do a block party for real. Like, yeah.
We're all there.
Also, I gotta say, One of the things that you were expressing so beautifully about the real journey being about just trying to get closer to your values and not just ultimately you're good or bad was also expressed beautifully in season 3 of The Good Place.
Oh, The Good Place.
Yeah.
Y'all go watch The Good Place. Just do it.
Yes.
Like, don't read my book. Don't just go watch The Good Place. So get it on.
Man, this band has been trying to get me on that for a minute.
Any spoilers? I just gotta let you know the last season will have you crying.
Mhm.
Yes, there you go. There it is.
She's there.
We love The Good Place.
You guys are gonna make me watch The Good Place. I haven't seen it yet.
David says watch The Good Place. You're watching The Good Place.
Let's do it one better.
Yeah.
Oh yes. Man, I hope Grace in heaven.
Everything is gritty.
Terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. Well, I knew we would get here by the end of the night.
Yeah.
This has been this might actually, I think this is the longest regular team stream that we have done, which just speaks to how engaging this conversation has been and how helpful it has been and how much more we have to talk about. I mean,
I'll come back anytime, y'all.
we would
Yeah.
love that. That invitation is open.
I gotta say, we owe David a big thanks because ever since one of his comments earlier on in this episode, in the chats online, fans have been pledging not to come to our shows and say, "We know what you're gonna play. Just play that. That's all you should do." So he's improved our fan interaction already.
Yes. and lent to our mission statement. Thank you, Rusty. Lent to our mission statement because it really is about, figuring out what are your core values and assessing consistently and constantly, am I closer to that or further from that? And it doesn't have to come with judgment, but just a recognition of, okay, I seem to be further. Let's get closer again and keep trying to get closer and closer and closer, even if that's an asymptotic journey and you never actually achieve your ultimate enlightenment goals. There's still that journey. And I love what you said about that America itself is a value and that idea is worth fighting for, even though we have never actually managed to achieve it in our history. The fact that we have the ideal to move toward is so important. I wanted to ask you one final question, which is there advice? We've gotten some tidbits of it throughout this discussion. Is there advice that you would leave people with about how to combat their own cognitive biases, about how to, it's not so much about trying to fix other people, but just how to each of us go about our days, make one little change, something like that to combat those biases that we might not even know we have.
All right, so I'm gonna come up with a 3-step plan here. Right, one, write down your values. Take a weekend. Just take some time, sit with yourself, be with yourself, and just write down just 5 things you actually definitely believe to be true. So for me, I believe in compassion. I believe in helping people who are suffering. I believe in curiosity and exploring. I believe in that. I believe in treating people like people and not like numbers, not like dollar signs. Just write that shit down. Write it down somewhere you can look at it anytime you want. And look at that shit once a day. 2, start to figure out what patterns in your life don't fit with those values. So I'm a filmmaker, I'm a film buff. And when I looked at it, I saw that 90% of the movies I love that I'm familiar with are directed by white guys. So I grew up in the 80s, action films of the 80s, some problematic shit. And so the pattern for me for director, if you say the word director, I think of a white dude. That's not because I believe that men are better directors than women. Far from it, but that's the pattern. So I actively now seek to fight that pattern. I seek out movies directed by women, written by women of color, directed by LGBTQ. I literally have a list of these are all the different intersectionalities I want to expose myself to, actively seek those out, right? And they're amazing. And they're expanding and opening up, right? And it's going to take a while to start a new pattern, but I am actively trying to fight that pattern. You have to just make a choice. So find the patterns you want to disrupt and start disrupting. That's 2. And then 3, take some of the beliefs you have, some of this sort of, I don't want to say beliefs, not values, but just beliefs, ideas that you have, and actively challenge them. I am terrified of cops. But one day I sat there and I asked myself, what is the actual probability of me getting killed by a cop? And so I just did some digging. And yes, my odds of getting shot by a cop are way worse, right, than some white dude. But you know who it's even worse for? Far worse? Native Americans. Native Americans get shot by cops way more. Like if you're just playing Risk, right, and you wanted to choose, and you got to choose purely based on your likelihood of getting shot by a cop, you're gonna actively choose black eye in that scenario. I wouldn't have known that if I just listened to Twitter, right? Passively accepting what I get. I would never have known that. But when I actively asked the question, am I in fact in the highest risk group for being killed by a police officer? It took like 10 minutes of Googling. This is not some huge quest you have to go on. Just ask the question and see what you find out. So those 3 things are just great ways to get out of your head, get out of your pattern, and start moving more toward what you believe.
Say, I love that you said, ask the question, not know the answer, right? Because I think a lot of this, the fear and the, I don't want to be caught out, or I don't want to say the wrong thing or think the wrong thing. I think that comes to, okay, well, one way to solve that is I'm going to go and know all the answers, which is not exactly what it's about. It's really about asking questions that, as you say, can be Googled in 10 minutes. And you can find a lot of really helpful stuff.
Item 1 of combating that thoughtlessness and having those good discussions, as David was saying, neither of us has the answer. We start the conversation.
Get comfortable with saying I don't.
We don't
get
know.
real comfortable with that.
Well, I don't know what we just did tonight, but it was great.
And I don't know when we're going to have David Dylan Thomas back, but I hope it's soon because this is fantastic.
Yeah.
Definitely going to see him in a block party. And just so everybody knows, we also have been simulcasting this last, 48 minutes now, since 11 p.m. on Clubhouse. So
Clubhouse.
That's right. Hey, Clubhouse.
I don't own an iPhone in your face.
That's
I'm on
right.
Clubhouse
That's
anyway.
right. They're going to be opening up to Android soon. So that if you look at the, I believe Dolio the Sleuth tweeted it. I at the Sleeves also tweeted it. Might also be on the Gangstagrass account, but we will be having regular Clubhouse rooms and tweeting out links to that. So if you're not already a member of Clubhouse, those links can scoot you ahead of the line and get you in. So keep an eye out for that, because as David was saying, there are some amazing discussions happening on Clubhouse. Like on any social media, there's some chaff too.
Yeah, there's there's some social media bros on there. I'll warn you now.
That's true. But you can avoid them by.
And just a correction on Twitter, it's at Sleuth Media.
Oh, at Sleuth Media, that's right. Instagram at Dolio the Sleuth.
I do own the Dolio the Sleuth account on Twitter, but it is deprecated.
Well, that makes me curious. How about you guys? That's great. We will definitely hope to see folks on Clubhouse as well. David Dylan Thomas is on Clubhouse. He is an author, design for cognitive bias, and a content strategist. We will be calling you, Dave.
Get the book, y'all. Get the book.
Get the book.
A little longer so people can screenshot.
There you go.
That's right.
Don't support capitalism. Support that business.
Yeah, this is a small book. You can't get this shit on Amazon. This is a small business, book apart. They're brilliant publishers. DavidDylanThomas.com if you want to say hi.
DavidDylanThomas.com. Check it out. Designed for cognitive bias. And we will be back. Whose dance party is it tomorrow? 3 p.m. Gangstagrass.tv.
What is it? I'd like it to be mine. I'm going to take it.
All right. Wrench is taking it.
Because
it's happening.
May Day dance party.
Oh, yeah.
Somebody earlier said, I'm looking forward to Danjo tomorrow, so I think maybe they heard it as Dan's party.
Ah.
I had Wednesday.
Dan's party is on Wednesday. The Danjo
Dan's
party is on Wednesday. Yes. So join us 3 p.m. Eastern, Gangstagrass.tv for the Wrench dance party, which will often include a word salad song where you get to throw words into the chat and Wrench will just create a song from it. But who knows? It's May Day. Anything could happen.
Plus some ruminations on things like simplicity versus complexity. And tomorrow I will be doing some DJing of a May Day workers' power dance set.
I hope that your entire set tomorrow is just you sitting there like unpacking cognitive bias, just like, but what does it really mean? What is he saying?
I gave this one talk in Germany. It was like, live cast, whatever. And they had a DJ. So it was me and this other person talking. And after I gave my talk, they remixed it. And it was
nice. I am looking forward to spending some time tomorrow arguing with the one fan on social media who says that the fact that you are trying to pick movies by black filmmakers is just reverse racism.
You gotta love the reverse racism shit. Oh my god.
Yeah.
So I'll be trying to deploy some of the conversational guidelines that you have laid out here to.
There you go. Ask them if they feel like they have the answer.
Yeah. I mean, can you blame a black guy for wanting to see a movie where they don't kill the black character first?
Yeah.
Usually,
I really love
when you tell a heartfelt story where you start to get to know them very well.
I love our fans because we get to have these. I love our fans because we get to figure out how to help people out.
Great. It's all about incentivizing the thoughtfulness and the complexity, and the more that gets the more that conversations like this get rewarded. I feel like I heard somebody say this. The more that conversations like this get rewarded, the more conversations like this can happen, and the better we all get at all of this stuff.
Hey.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, David.
Yes.
Thank you, David.
Such a pleasure.
Yes.
That's
Have a
something
good night, y'all.
when
Have a good night, man.
we all do better when we all do better.
Yeah.
Ain't nothing better than that.
All right.
That's right. That's right. All right. Good night, everybody.
All right, y'all. See you next time.
We do it.